There is a game out right now that almost nobody is talking about deeply enough, and after spending weeks digging through every fragment of lore I could find, I think Blue Gate might be the most unsettling location in Ark Raiders, and I want to show you exactly why. I put this video together because the lore around Blue Gate kept nagging at me. Every time I thought I had a clear picture, another piece of in-game text or environmental detail shifted the whole thing sideways. So I decided to sit down, collect everything, and try to build a coherent timeline. One choice I made early on was to focus less on the Ark itself as a physical threat and more on what Blue Gate represents as a human institution, because I think that framing unlocks a lot of details that get overlooked when people focus purely on the invasion angle. Some material about the broader geopolitical context before the Ark arrived got trimmed down, not because it's unimportant, but because it pulled focus away from the tighter story I was trying to tell. Everything here is my interpretation based on available lore. Where the game is ambiguous, I'll say so. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the Ark invasion, but the beginning of the world that existed before any of this happened. The setting of Ark Raiders is Earth, but not the Earth we know right now. It is a version of our planet that has already been through enormous upheaval, already reorganized itself politically and economically in ways that diverge from our present reality. The details are scattered across loading screen texts, item descriptions, and overheard NPC dialogue, and piecing them together gives you a picture of a civilization that was, by most measures, functional. Not utopian, not dystopian, just a world that had found a particular shape and was living inside it. Cities existed. Infrastructure existed. There were corporations, governments, research programs, military branches. People went to work. People had families. The ordinary texture of human life continued, right up until it didn't. One thing the lore suggests strongly is that the period before the Ark was marked by a kind of accelerated technological development, not science fiction level, not teleportation and flying cars, but a recognizable extension of the trajectory we are already on. Automation, material science, advanced manufacturing, AI-assisted logistics. The world had gotten very good at building things and moving things around. Blue Gate, as a location, belongs firmly to this pre-ark era. It was constructed during a period of active development, and the decisions that went into building it were made by people who had no idea what was coming. That context matters. It means everything about Blue Gate was designed with a completely different threat model in mind. The name itself is worth pausing on. Blue Gate. It suggests a threshold, an entrance, something you pass through to reach something else. The color blue carries connotations in institutional design. Authority, stability, trust. Whoever named it was thinking in the vocabulary of bureaucracy and infrastructure, not warfare or survival. That tells you something about the mentality of the people who built it. The facility sits within a landscape that has been heavily transformed by the Ark invasion. Environmental law, the state of surrounding structures, the distribution of debris, the way vegetation has grown back in certain places, suggests that Blue Gate survived the initial phases of the invasion better than most structures in its region. It did not survive intact, but it survived well enough to still be meaningful. That survival is not accidental. The lore hints. Blue Gate was built to last. The construction materials, the depth of certain subterranean sections, the redundant systems, all of it points toward a facility that was designed to continue functioning under conditions of significant external pressure. The question the lore keeps raising without quite answering is, what kind of pressure were the designers actually anticipating? Pre-ark Earth had its tensions. There are fragments suggesting resource conflicts, regional instability, the usual friction of a world with uneven development and competing interests. A reinforced, partially underground facility in this context makes a certain kind of sense. It could be military logistics, could be critical infrastructure protection, could be research requiring isolation from interference. The lore does not commit to a single answer, and I think that ambiguity is deliberate. The game wants you to bring your own reading to Blue Gate, and then it wants to complicate that reading as you go deeper. What we can establish with reasonable confidence is that Blue Gate was operational before the Ark arrived. Staff were present, systems were running, there was a purpose being served. Whatever that purpose was, the Ark invasion, when it came, did not arrive gently. The lore describes the initial contact period as chaotic and overwhelming. Not a slow escalation, but something closer to a sudden imposition of a new reality. Human institutions that had spent decades preparing for terrestrial threats found themselves completely outside their operational frameworks. Blue Gate's records from this period are fragmented. This is partly because the invasion damaged data infrastructure broadly, and partly because the lore hints there were deliberate decisions made about what to preserve and what to destroy. That detail is easy to miss. The idea that someone inside Blue Gate was making choices about records during the worst of the invasion suggests that not everyone there was simply trying to survive. Someone was thinking about the future. Someone was thinking about what story would be told later. This is where the pre-ark history stops being background context and starts being active mystery. The world before the Ark built Blue Gate for a reason. The people inside it survived the initial invasion for a reason. And the choices they made during that chaos shaped everything that came after. The Ark, as described across various lore fragments, is not simply a weapon or a natural disaster. It behaves with something resembling intention, even if that intention is alien enough that human categories struggle to describe it properly. Its machines, the things you fight as a raider, operate with coordination that implies hierarchy, communication, purpose. They are not random. They are pursuing something. What they are pursuing, and why Blue Gate might be relevant to that pursuit, is one of the central questions this video is going to work through. But to get there, we need to understand what the pre-ark world was actually like, and more specifically, what kind of institution Blue Gate was before the sky changed. The lore suggests a facility that sat at an intersection of interests, not purely military, not purely corporate, not purely governmental, something that overlapped all three in ways that were probably intentional. Institutions that serve multiple masters often do so because they hold something multiple masters want access to. That structure, a facility sitting at the intersection of competing interests, becomes very important later, because when the Ark arrived and the old power structures started collapsing, whoever controlled Blue Gate suddenly held a very different kind of leverage. The pre-ark staff records that survive are partial, but they point toward a workforce that was technically skilled, compartmentalized, meaning different teams knew different things, and not everyone had full picture of operations, and subject to fairly strict information controls. That last detail is not unusual for sensitive facilities, but the degree suggested by the law is notable. People working at Blue Gate during the pre-ark period apparently did not fully know what they were working on. Or more precisely, they knew their piece of it, but the assembled whole was visible only to a small number of people at the top. That compartmentalization survived the invasion. In fact, the law suggests it intensified afterward. Whatever Blue Gate became post-ark, it kept the same basic architecture of information control that defined it before. Think about what that means for the people who sheltered there during the invasion. They were surviving together, presumably relying on each other, building the kinds of intense bonds that crisis creates. And at the same time, the institutional structure around them was actively managing what each of them knew. That tension between collective survival and institutional secrecy is one of the emotional undercurrents the law keeps returning to. It is not stated explicitly in any single document. It is assembled from small details, a personal note here, a system log there, a piece of graffiti that only makes sense if you already know what to look for. The pre-ark world also had its share of people who were paying attention to things that others were not. The law gestures towards individuals and groups who were tracking anomalies, unusual signals, patterns that did not fit existing models. Whether any of these people had any idea what was actually coming is unclear. But the existence of that kind of watchfulness before the invasion says something about the world's epistemic atmosphere. There was a sense, at least in some quarters, that something was approaching. Blue Gate's position in relation to that pre-invasion awareness is one of the things I find most compelling about its lore. There are hints that the facility was involved in monitoring or research that placed it closer to the edge of that awareness than most institutions. Not necessarily that they knew the Ark was coming, but that they were among the first to register that something was wrong. The first anomalous readings, the early signals that Ark machines were approaching, the initial breakdown of predictive models. Blue Gate may have been watching all of it in real time, weeks or even months before the broader world understood what was happening. If that reading is right, it means the decisions made inside Blue Gate during that pre-impact window were made by people who had more information than almost anyone else on Earth, and the choices they made with that information, what to do, who to tell, what to prepare, are buried somewhere in the facility's records. Finding those records, understanding those choices, is part of what makes Blue Gate so compelling as a destination for raiders. The pre-ark Earth that built this place was also a world that had, in various ways, been thinking about scenarios of civilizational stress, not alien invasion specifically, but collapse, conflict, resource crisis. The general category of situations where normal infrastructure fails and the things that matter most need to be protected and preserved. Blue Gate fits into a lineage of facilities designed with exactly that kind of thinking. Bunkers, archives, continuity of government infrastructure. The post-Ark world is full of these places. Most of them failed, most of them stripped or destroyed, or simply abandoned when the people inside ran out of reasons to stay. Blue Gate is different. Blue Gate is still, in some meaningful sense, active. The lore suggests ongoing processes, not just physical ruins. Systems still running, something still being maintained, or at least still maintaining itself. That persistence, a pre-Ark institution that somehow continued to function through the invasion and is still doing something in the present of the game, is the central mystery. And it starts here, in this chapter, with the world that built it and the people who decided it was worth building in the first place. The deeper you go into the pre-Ark lore, the more you get a sense of a civilization that was, without quite knowing it, building its own legacy, the things it made, the institutions it created, the choices it embedded into infrastructure. All of it outlasted the civilization itself, in fragmentary, distorted form. Blue Gate is one of those fragments, one of the most intact, one of the most consequential. And as we move through this timeline, what you'll find is that the mystery of Blue Gate is not just about what is inside it, it is about why it was built, what it was built to protect, and whether the people who built it understood, even dimly, what they were ultimately preparing for. The pre-Ark world set something in motion at Blue Gate. The Ark invasion accelerated it, and the present of Ark raiders is living inside the consequences. That is the frame. Now let's go deeper. The civilization that built Blue Gate was not naive. It had seen enough of its own history to know that institutions fail, that records get lost, that what seems permanent turns out not to be. The design choices embedded in the facility reflect that awareness. Redundancy, depth, multiple layers of access control, systems designed to continue operating without human input for extended periods. Whoever the architects were, they were thinking on a long time scale. They were not just solving a present problem. They were trying to ensure that whatever Blue Gate held would still be holdable generations later. That long-term thinking is unusual. Most infrastructure is built for immediate operational needs, with maybe a decade or two of planning horizon. Blue Gate's design implies something more like a century, maybe more. Why would you build that way unless you believed that what you were protecting was worth protecting for a very long time? And what, exactly, would that be? The lore does not answer this directly in the pre-Ark material, but it plants the question firmly enough that you carry it with you through everything that follows. It is one of those details that retroactively recontextualizes everything else once you notice it. By the time the Ark arrived, Blue Gate had been operating for long enough to have accumulated layers, personnel who had been there for decades, processes that had evolved away from their original specifications, institutional culture, the unwritten rules and understandings that grow up around any long-running organization. That accumulated depth is part of what makes the post-ark version of Blue Gate so hard to pass. You are not just dealing with what it became after the invasion. You are dealing with what it already was, which was itself already complicated. The pre-ark chapter of Blue Gate's history ends not with the ark's arrival, but slightly before it, with the window of awareness, however narrow, when someone inside that facility knew something enormous was coming and had to decide what to do. That decision point is where the real story begins. Chapter 2. First Contact and the Collapse of the Surface. The Ark did not arrive the way science fiction had trained people to expect. There was no single dramatic moment, no enormous vessel descending through clouds, no declaration or ultimatum. The law suggests something more like an infestation, a distributed, multi-vector arrival that overwhelmed detection and response. Before most institutions had time to coordinate, Blue Gate was among the first facilities to register what was happening, if the law's hints are read correctly. The monitoring systems that were part of its original design, whatever their intended purpose, were picking up anomalies that human analysts were struggling to categorize. The initial response to those anomalies was institutional in the worst sense. Reports went up chains of command. Queries were sent to external agencies for confirmation. Protocols were followed, and while all of that procedural machinery was grinding through its normal cycles, the situation on the surface was accelerating past the point where protocols were useful. This gap between the speed of the Ark's arrival and the speed of human institutional response is something the law returns to repeatedly. Not as an indictment, exactly, more as a description of a structural incompatibility. Human systems are built for human speed events. What arrived was not moving at human speed. The people inside Blue Gate during first contact were in an unusual position. Their monitoring gave them better situational awareness than most. But awareness is not the same as capability. Knowing what is happening and being able to do anything about it are very different things. And the law suggests that the gap between those two things was devastating. Personal logs from this period, fragmentary, partially corrupted, but recoverable enough to extract meaning from, described the emotional texture of those days, a shift from professional concern to something closer to dread, the recognition that the training and preparation that had defined careers was simply not applicable to what was unfolding. One thread in those logs that I find particularly striking is the recurrence of a specific kind of dissonance, people describing the mundane details of their surroundings, the hum of equipment, the smell of recycled air, the sound of footsteps in corridors, against the backdrop of catastrophic information coming in through their screens, the ordinary continuing inside while the extraordinary consumed the outside. That dissonance is part of what the game captures in Blue Gate's physical environment. The facility was not designed as a survival bunker. It was designed as an operational facility, and yet it ended up serving as both, which means it carries traces of both purposes layered on top of each other. The surface collapse happened in stages. This is important because it means different people had different experiences depending on when they lost access to the outside world. Some Blue Gate personnel had contact with surface events for weeks before the facility went into lockdown. Others arrived during or after lockdown and only know the surface through second-hand accounts. That variation in experience created fault lines within the survivor community inside Blue Gate. Not immediately. The crisis compressed people together initially, but later, those differences in what people had witnessed and what they had not witnessed became sources of friction and misunderstanding. The law gestures towards these tensions, without dramatizing them. A note here, a discrepancy between two accounts there, the kind of traces that institutional history leaves when it is trying not to draw attention to its own conflicts. The Ark's behavior during the first contact period is described in terms that suggest it was not simply attacking, it was also, simultaneously, doing something else, something that observers struggled to name. The law uses terms like assessing, mapping, cataloguing. The machines moved through the surface world with what looked like curiosity as much as aggression. That behavior pattern becomes significant later, particularly in relation to Blue Gate, because if the Ark was cataloguing, the question becomes, what was it finding worth cataloguing, and did Blue Gate appear on whatever list it was compiling? Surface infrastructure failed unevenly. Some communications networks stayed up longer than expected. Some power grids went down immediately. Supply chains collapsed almost universally. The picture that emerges is of a civilization whose interdependencies, which had been strengths, became vulnerabilities when key nodes started failing. Blue Gate's design insulated it from some of this. Redundant power, internal water processing, stored supplies. The facility was not comfortable during this period. The law makes clear that conditions became difficult quickly, but it did not fail. It kept running. The decision to seal the facility was made at some point during the early collapse, and the law around that decision is deliberately murky. Who made it, and on what authority, and what it meant for people who were outside when it happened. These are questions the game raises without fully resolving. What is clear is that the sealing of Blue Gate was not a neutral act. People were included and excluded. Whatever community formed inside the sealed facility formed under conditions set by whoever controlled the access. That power dynamic shaped everything that followed. The first weeks inside a sealed Blue Gate were, by the account of surviving records, characterized by a kind of suspended disbelief. People kept performing their professional roles, maintaining routines, following schedules that the external world had made irrelevant. The structure of normal work was a way of not confronting what had happened. This is a recognizable psychological response to catastrophe, and the law treats it with some sympathy. The people inside Blue Gate were not in denial exactly. They were deploying the tools they had: competence, routine, professional identity, against a situation those tools were not designed to address. The Ark machines, in this early period, apparently did not engage heavily with Blue Gate directly, whether this was because the facility's design made it effectively invisible, or because the Ark was occupied with higher priority targets, or because of something else entirely. The law suggests, but does not confirm, various possibilities. That period of relative non-engagement was valuable. It gave the people inside Blue Gate time to organize, assess resources, establish a functioning internal order, but it also created a false sense that the facility's protection would hold indefinitely. The first direct Ark contact with the Blue Gate area, when it came, was different from what people expected based on the reports they had been getting about surface events. The law describes it as more targeted, more deliberate, less like the chaotic sweeping action that characterized much of the surface assault, and more like something that knew what it was looking for. That difference in Ark behavior is one of the data points that suggests Blue Gate was specifically interesting to whatever intelligence guides the Ark's machines. The targeted nature of the contact implies prior knowledge. How the Ark would have prior knowledge of a compartmentalized, partially underground facility designed to minimize its external profile is one of the questions that sits at the heart of Blue Gate's mystery. The people inside Blue Gate noticed this difference too. The law contains accounts of the debate that followed, some arguing it was coincidence or random variation in Ark behavior, others insisting the pattern was meaningful and that the facility's security posture needed to fundamentally change. This disagreement was not just technical, it was also political, because if the Ark knew about Blue Gate, the question of how it knew implicated whoever had controlled the facility's information security. And in a closed community under stress, accusations of that kind are dangerous. The records from this period show evidence of both sides of that argument, and the fact that the records survive in this form, showing a genuine dispute rather than a unified official account, suggests that whoever maintained Blue Gate's archive was not sanitizing history in the way that some institutions would have, or alternatively, that they did not have time to. The surface collapse continued while all of this was happening inside Blue Gate. The world outside was being transformed in ways that would take years to fully understand. Ecosystems disrupted, infrastructure destroyed, human communities scattered or destroyed or forced into forms of organization that bore little resemblance to what had existed before. Blue Gate, sealed and surviving, was becoming an island, not geographically. It had always been geographically fixed, but socially and epistemically. The connection to the broader human world was fraying. The facility was increasingly self-referential, sustained by its own internal logic and resources. That isolation is one of the things that makes Blue Gate's later history so strange, because institutions that become isolated from external feedback tend to develop in idiosyncratic ways, the normal checks that come from being part of a larger social world, the need to justify yourself to outsiders, the correction that comes from encountering different practices and ideas. Those are removed. What grows in isolation tends to grow in the direction set by whoever controls the environment. And in Blue Gate's case, that meant growing in the direction set by a very small number of people with access to information that the rest of the community did not have. The collapse of the surface was not the end of the world in the literal sense. People survived, communities formed. The raiders you play as are evidence of ongoing human life, but it was the end of the world that built Blue Gate, and the beginning of something new that Blue Gate was going to have to navigate on its own terms. How it navigated that transition, and what it became as a result, is the subject of what follows. The first contact period established a pattern that Blue Gate would follow for years afterward. Isolation, information asymmetry, targeted arc attention, and the community holding together under conditions that were constantly testing whether holding together was actually possible. The mysteries that Blue Gate presents to raiders in the present day are not mysteries that appeared after the invasion. They are mysteries that the invasion revealed. Tensions and secrets and purposes that were already embedded in the facility before the Ark ever arrived, and that the collapse of the surface world removed the ability to contain or contextualize. Blue Gate, after first contact, was Blue Gate unmasked, but even unmasked, it kept its secrets close. The surface world did not simply stop. It adapted, as human communities always do, into whatever forms the new conditions allowed. Raiders, scavengers, survivors, people making a living in the ruins, began to move through the transformed landscape, and inevitably, some of them found Blue Gate, or found traces of it, from people who had been inside. Those stories, filtered through the social networks of the post-Ark survivor world, became part of the mythology around Blue Gate, not the internal history, which was still controlled and largely unknown, but the external perception, what the facility looked like from outside, what it was rumoured to contain, why people thought it mattered. That mythology is itself a kind of lore layer, and it adds texture to the picture. Blue Gate, as understood by the outside world, was different from Blue Gate as it actually was. Both versions are real, in different ways, and both shaped how people related to it. For raiders, operating in the present of the game, that double reality is something they have to navigate. The mythology shaped the expectations that brought people to Blue Gate. The actuality is what they find when they get there. And the gap between those two things is where the real story lives. Chapter 3. The Architects and the Hidden Purpose. Every institution with secrets has people who know those secrets, and Blue Gate is no exception. The lore points toward a layer of personnel at Blue Gate whose understanding of the facility was categorically different from everyone else's. Not just more information, but a fundamentally different frame for what Blue Gate was and what it was for. These are the architects in the broad sense, not just the people who designed the physical structure, but the people who designed its purpose. Some of them may have been present from the facility's inception. Others may have been read into the true picture at various points. What unites them, in the lore's telling, is that they knew something the rest of Blue Gate's community did not. The question of what they knew is one of the most carefully rationed pieces of information in the game's lore. Fragments point toward it from multiple directions, without ever providing a clean summary. This is either because the game is deliberately building toward a revelation, or because the lore is designed to remain genuinely ambiguous, one possible reading versus another possible reading, with no final adjudication. What can be assembled from the available fragments is something like this. Blue Gate was not built primarily for the purposes it appeared to serve. The official function, whatever it was real but secondary. The primary purpose was something else, something that the official function provided cover for, or perhaps scaffolding toward. That kind of layered institutional design is not unheard of in real-world history. Facilities that serve one visible purpose, while simultaneously serving another, less visible one. The people who work in the visible layer are not necessarily deceived in a malicious sense. They are simply doing their jobs, which are real jobs, producing real outputs. The hidden layer runs alongside, managed by a smaller group, insulated from the broader workforce. The law suggests that Blue Gate's hidden layer was specifically concerned with data, not just data storage or processing, in a general sense, but a particular kind of data. Information that, if the hints are read correctly, relates to the Ark itself, or to conditions that predate the Ark's arrival by a significant margin. This is where the pre-ark and post-ark law start to link up, in ways that are genuinely unsettling, because if Blue Gate's hidden purpose involved data that was relevant to the Ark before the Ark arrived, that either means someone anticipated the Ark's coming, which raises enormous questions, or that there is something about that data which the Ark recognizes as significant for reasons we do not yet fully understand. Either reading is extraordinary, and the law supports both without conclusively choosing between them. The architects of Blue Gate, in the law's implicit telling, were people operating under conditions of unusual epistemic pressure. They knew things that, if widely shared, would have been destabilizing, the kind of information that forces people to revise not just their current plans, but their entire model of what the world is and how it works. Managing that kind of information, deciding who gets to know it, how much, when, is a specific kind of institutional responsibility, and it tends to create a specific kind of psychology in the people who carry it, a combination of guardianship and isolation. A sense of being responsible for something larger than can be explained, in a world that is not ready to understand it. The law gives you glimpses of that psychology in the personal records of people who appear to have been part of the inner layer, not explicit confessions, nothing that cleanly lays out what they knew, but the texture of their writing, the things they chose to note, and the things they conspicuously avoided noting, suggests the weight of information held close. One recurring element in these fragments is time, references to long-term processes, to things that were already underway before the writer joined them, to a sense that the work at Blue Gate was a continuation rather than a beginning. This suggests institutional memory going back further than the facility's apparent construction date. That discontinuity, a purpose older than the facility built to serve it, is one of the most interesting threads in the Blue Gate lore. It implies that whatever Blue Gate is protecting or maintaining was not created there. It was brought there, or directed there, or the facility was built around something that already existed. The physical layout of Blue Gate supports this reading in certain ways. There are sections of the facility whose integration with the rest of the structure is architecturally awkward, as if they were not part of the original design, but were accommodated after the fact, or as if the original design was built around a pre-existing core that it had to work around. Environmental law, the texture of walls, the routing of conduits, the placement of access points suggests that the deepest sections of Blue Gate are older than the rest. Not by decades necessarily, but older, and built to different specifications, suggesting a different era and possibly different designers. This nested architecture, older core inside newer shell, is a physical metaphor for the institutional structure, the visible layer built around the hidden one, the official purpose encasing the actual purpose. The architects who knew about this core and what it contained or represented were the custodians of something they did not create. They inherited it from previous custodians who inherited it from custodians before them. The chain of custody goes back further than the law currently traces, which is either a gap in the available fragments or a deliberate choice about what to leave mysterious. When the Ark arrived and Blue Gate sealed itself off, the architects faced a specific kind of crisis. The external structures that had provided their cover, the institutions and jurisdictions and authorities that had sanctioned Blue Gate's existence and kept its secrets at the societal level, were gone, collapsed, scattered, made irrelevant by the invasion, that left the architects in a position of pure institutional inheritance. They had the keys to something that no longer had a broader context. The thing they were guarding was now their responsibility in an absolute sense, without any external authority to appeal to or defer to. Some of the most significant decisions in Blue Gate's post-ark history appear to have been made during this period of contextual vacuum. Decisions about who else should be told, about what to do with the core, about whether the facility's hidden purpose should be continued or suspended or transformed into something new. The law hints that these decisions were not unanimous. The architects, small in number, apparently disagreed among themselves about the right course of action. And disagreements among people holding secrets in a sealed facility under stress tend not to resolve cleanly. What emerged from that period of internal conflict was a Blue Gate with a particular orientation, a set of choices about purpose and priority that shaped everything subsequent. The law does not give you those choices directly. It gives you their consequences, spread across the physical and informational landscape of the facility, and asks you to work backward. Working backward from consequences is exactly what raiders do. And it is exactly what this video is trying to do, to reconstruct the decisions from their traces, to understand the architects from their works. The hidden purpose, whatever its precise content, appears to have involved a relationship between Blue Gate and the Ark that is not simply adversarial. This is one of the most unsettling suggestions in the law, not that the architects were collaborators in a simple sense, not that they welcomed the invasion, but that the relationship between what Blue Gate held and what the Ark was pursuing was more complex than opposition. The possibility that Blue Gate and the Ark were, in some sense, aimed at the same thing, by different parties, from different directions, with different intentions, is one of the readings that the law leaves open. It would explain both the Ark's unusual attention to the facility and the architect's decisions to maintain rather than destroy the core, even as the invasion consumed the surface. If both parties wanted the same thing, and one party had it and the other was coming to take it, then the survival strategy for the party holding it was not destruction. It was protection and concealment, and that is exactly what Blue Gate, structurally and behaviourally, appears to have been doing. The architects understood this. Whether they understood it fully or only partially, whether they acted on that understanding wisely or poorly, those are the evaluative questions the law raises without settling. What is clear is that they made choices, significant choices, and those choices are embedded in Blue Gate's structure, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and the right access to read them. Raiders, by definition, are people who go into places most people consider too dangerous to enter. Blue Gate attracts that kind of person for reasons that go beyond the material value of what might be found there. It attracts them because it feels like it contains an answer to something. Not necessarily a comfortable answer, but an answer the architects built that quality into the place, whether they intended to or not. When you design something around a secret, the secret shapes the design in ways that are legible to anyone paying close enough attention. Blue Gate announces its hidden purpose in the texture of its architecture, in the awkward integrations and the deeper than necessary constructions, and the systems that seem overbuilt for any ordinary operational need. The architects tried to hide what they were doing. They were not entirely successful, not because they were incompetent, but because the thing they were trying to hide was too significant to be fully contained. Truth that size leaves marks. Chapter 4. The Keepers. Who runs Blue Gate now? The Ark invasion changed power everywhere it touched, and Blue Gate was no exception. The formal authority structures that had governed the facility before the invasion, chains of command, institutional mandates, external oversight, were either eliminated or made effectively irrelevant. What replaced them was something more improvised, more contested, and more interesting. The law uses several terms and designations that suggest organized internal factions within Bluegate, though it is careful not to draw them too neatly. These are not cartoon factions with uniforms and manifestos. They are tendencies, orientations, clusters of people who share certain assumptions about what Bluegate is and what it should be doing. The group I am calling the Keepers, a term I am applying loosely based on behavioral patterns in the law, rather than any explicit descended from the original architects, not necessarily the same individuals, since the post-ark timeline covers enough time for generations, but the same institutional lineage. Their core conviction appears to be that Bluegate's original hidden purpose should be maintained and protected, that whatever was being done before the Ark arrived should continue to be done, regardless of how much the external world has changed. The original purpose is, to them, the thing that justifies the facility's existence and everything that has been sacrificed to keep it running. This is a conservative position in the deepest sense of the word, a commitment to conserving something, continuing a project whose origins predate the current personnel and whose full rationale may not even be fully understood by those continuing it. The law suggests that this conservative commitment has a particular flavour at Bluegate. It is not just about maintaining physical infrastructure or preserving records. It is about maintaining a specific kind of relationship with information, continuing to control what is known, by whom and how it is framed. The keepers in this reading are information managers as much as they are anything else. Their justification for this information management is, in the law's telling, genuinely held. They are not simply power-hungry people maintaining control for its own sake. They believe, with conviction, that the information at Bluegate's core is dangerous, if widely distributed. Not just tactically dangerous in the way that any sensitive information might be, but something more fundamental. Information that, if broadly understood, would change how people relate to the Ark, to each other, to the situation they are all in. Whether that belief is correct, or is a self-serving rationalization, or is some mixture of both, is one of the questions the law leaves genuinely open. The keeper's practical position at Bluegate involves control of specific physical spaces, particularly the deepest sections, and control of specific systems, especially data systems. Their ability to maintain this control in the post-ark period is a function of the fact that they have knowledge others lack. They know how to operate systems that nobody else fully understands. That technical knowledge is their leverage, and it creates a particular kind of dependency. The broader Bluegate community needs the keeper's expertise to keep critical systems running, which means they have to tolerate the keeper's information restrictions, even when those restrictions are frustrating and arguably harmful. This dynamic, expertise as institutional power, is one of the more psychologically realistic elements of the Bluegate law. It captures something true about how knowledge hierarchies function under conditions of scarcity and stress. The people who challenge the keepers are doing so from a position of structural disadvantage. They can see that something is being withheld. They can feel the effects of the information asymmetry. But they lack the specific technical knowledge to simply take over the systems themselves. What they have instead is numbers and moral authority, and the slowly accumulating evidence that the keeper's stewardship is producing outcomes that benefit the few at the cost of the many. The opposition to the keepers within Bluegate is not monolithic. The law shows several different orientations among those who challenge the existing order. Some want transparency. They believe the hidden information should be shared, that the whole community should understand what Bluegate is and what it holds. Some want reform. They accept the basic legitimacy of the keeper's role, but want more accountability and more sharing of decisions. Some want replacement. They believe the keepers should be removed from their positions entirely and a different group should take charge. These differences among the opposition matter, because they mean that even if the keepers were successfully challenged, the outcome would not be simple or unified. The conflict within Bluegate is not a two-sided thing, but a multi-sided one, with the apparent binary of keepers versus everyone else masking a much more complicated landscape of interests and values. The keepers, of course, benefit from that complexity. A divided opposition is easier to manage than a unified one. And the law hints that the keepers are not passive in this regard, that they have at various points made choices about information release or withholding that serve to maintain divisions among their challengers. That kind of active political management, using information to shape the landscape of opposition, is not something that people usually admit to doing, but it is visible in the consequences, in the patterns of what got revealed, to whom and when, in the way certain disputes within the broader community seem to have been fueled by timely leaks that served the keepers' interests. This does not make the keepers villains in a simple sense. Their belief in their mission is genuine, as far as the law can show, and there is at least some evidence that the information they are holding really is dangerous, that the fears they have about what would happen if it were released are not entirely paranoid. The tension at the heart of the keeper's position is a real tension, not a fake one manufactured for narrative convenience. Is it ever right to withhold information from people it directly affects, because you believe they would make bad decisions with it? Is custodial guardianship of dangerous knowledge a legitimate role, or is it always a form of paternalism that ultimately serves the guardian more than the people it claims to protect? These are not questions the law resolves. They are questions it holds in suspension, asking you to sit with the discomfort. The keeper's relationship with the Ark is one of the most carefully obscured aspects of their portrayal. The law hints, without confirming, that the keepers have a framework for understanding the Ark that is different from the purely adversarial model held by most of the post-Ark survivor world, that their custodianship of certain information gives them a perspective on what the Ark is and what it wants that complicates the simple picture of invader versus defender. If that is right, and it is one possible reading rather than a certain one, then the keepers are not just information managers. They are people trying to navigate a situation they understand differently from everyone around them, trying to protect something in a context where even the nature of the threat is not fully grasped by the people they are ostensibly protecting. That is a terrible position to be in. And it produces, in the law's portrayal, a specific kind of exhausted grimness. People who started with idealism and have been ground down by the gap between what they know and what they can say. Whether raiders who encounter Bluegate will find the keepers as allies, obstacles, or something more ambiguous depends entirely on which law threads they have followed and what interpretation they bring to those threads. That ambiguity is, I think, one of Ark Raider's most interesting design choices. Bluegate does not give you a clean moral map. It gives you a complicated institution and asks you to form your own view of it. The keepers, whatever their faults, have kept Bluegate running. They have maintained systems that benefit everyone inside, including their opponents. They have preserved information that, whatever its dangers, represents something important about the pre-ark world and the mystery at Bluegate's center. They have also, by the evidence of the law, made choices that cause suffering, excluded people who should have been included, and perpetuated a power structure that served their own interests as much as anyone else's. Both of these things are true. That is what makes them interesting. Chapter 5. The Ark's interest. Why does it keep coming back? The most persistent and most disturbing detail about Bluegate in all of Ark Raider's lore is the Ark's behavior toward it. Across multiple fragments, logs, and environmental clues, one pattern emerges clearly. The Ark returns to Bluegate with a frequency and specificity that it does not apply to most other surviving human installations. This is not normal Ark behavior. Most of the Ark machine activity in the game's world follows patterns that, while alien, make a certain kind of sense. If you think of the Ark as a distributed system optimizing for some objective, clearing threats, acquiring resources, transforming territory, that optimization produces pressure on anything humans are using or defending. But it does not usually produce the kind of targeted, repeated patient attention that Bluegate receives. The difference between general Ark pressure and targeted Ark attention is one of the key observational distinctions the law makes, and it makes it clearly enough that multiple independent sources within the game's text, people who have no reason to be coordinating their accounts, describe the same anomalous pattern from different vantage points. Something about Bluegate interests the Ark in a way that goes beyond normal operational logic, The law is explicit about this difference while being deliberately vague about the reason. The possible reasons, assembled from various law fragments, fall into a few broad categories. One category is material. The Ark wants something physically located at Blue Gate, something it has not yet been able to acquire either because of the facility's design or because of active resistance. Another category is informational. The Ark is responding to signals or emissions from Blue Gate's systems, treating the facility as a point of interest based on what it is broadcasting rather than what it physically contains. A third category is more unsettling and harder to articulate. There are fragments that suggest the Ark's interest in Blue Gate might be reactive rather than acquisitive. Not that the Ark wants something from Blue Gate, but that something at Blue Gate is affecting the Ark's behavior in ways that function like attention or concern, as if Blue Gate poses a threat to the Ark, and the Ark's repeated visits are an attempt to assess or neutralize that threat. This third reading, if it is right, completely inverts the normal power dynamic in the standard Ark raiders, framing the Ark as the existential threat and human survivors are the vulnerable ones. But if Blue Gate contains something the Ark considers threatening, then the facility is not just a refuge from the Ark. It is something the Ark is afraid of. That would explain a lot. It would explain why the facility was built the way it was. Whoever designed it knew, or suspected, that it needed to be capable of maintaining its function, even under sustained Ark pressure. It would explain the Keeper's commitment to maintaining that function at all costs. And it would explain the information control. If what Blue Gate contains is something that threatens the Ark, that information in the wrong hands could either be weaponized, which might be desirable, or could provoke escalated Ark response, which might be catastrophic. The law does not confirm this reading, but it does not rule it out either, and there are enough small details that it fits. Details that seem anomalous under other interpretations, but that make sense if you accept the premise that Blue Gate is not just surviving the Ark, but in some sense contesting it. The Ark machines that visit Blue Gate behave differently from Ark machines elsewhere in the game world. They are not less dangerous. They are arguably more dangerous, more persistent, more resistant to being driven off, more inclined to probe and test defenses rather than simply overwhelming them. But they also behave in ways that suggest they are not trying to simply destroy, they are trying to penetrate. The distinction between destruction and penetration is significant. A threat that wants to destroy you applies maximum force indiscriminately. A threat that wants to penetrate your defenses applies force selectively, looking for weaknesses, probing for points of entry. The Ark at Blue Gate is doing the latter. What it is trying to penetrate to is, naturally, the core, those deepest sections that the Keepers control and that the law suggests contain whatever Blue Gate was really built to house. The Keepers know this. Their entire defensive posture is built around protecting the core from Ark penetration. Whether they would characterize their knowledge of this pattern as confirmation of the Ark's interest, or as something more complicated, whether they have a framework for what the Ark knows and why it wants access, is unclear from the available law. But the pattern has been consistent enough for long enough that anyone inside Blue Gate who is paying attention cannot have missed it. The Ark comes back. It always focuses on the same areas. It tries the same approaches in cycles, as if it is waiting for conditions to change. It does not give up. That patience is itself unusual. The Ark, in most of its operations, is not patient in a way that looks intentional. It is persistent, which is not the same thing. But the Blue Gate pattern suggests something closer to strategic patience, a willingness to wait and try again, rather than simply moving on. This has contributed enormously to the mythology around Blue Gate in the broader Survivor world. Stories of a location that the Ark wants desperately and cannot have. A place where humans have held the line against something that has overwhelmed everything else. That mythology attracts raiders for reasons that go beyond simple material gain. There is a kind of glory-seeking involved, a desire to be part of the story of the place that held. The reality inside Blue Gate, as suggested by the law, is less glorious and more grinding. The Ark's patient attention has produced years of sustained pressure that has cost lives and resources, and psychological stability. Holding the line is not heroic in the moment. It is exhausting and incremental and full of losses. The lore captures this through the state of Blue Gate's physical environment. Signs of past breaches that were repaired, improvised reinforcements on structures that were never meant to be defensive. The absence of certain personnel who appear in early records, but not in later ones. The accumulation of small memorials and markers that people leave for the lost. Blue Gate is a place that has been fighting a long time. And the question of whether it can keep fighting, and what it is actually fighting for, is one of the central tensions the game uses this location to explore. The Ark's behavior toward Blue Gate also raises questions about what the Ark is, in a more fundamental sense. The standard model, alien automated machines pursuing programmed objectives, does not sit easily with the kind of targeted, patient, apparently purposeful behavior at Blue Gate. That behavior looks more like it comes from something with goals that are not just programmed but are in some sense understood. Understanding implies a kind of cognition, and the possibility that the Ark has something like cognition, that it is not just a machine running an algorithm, but something that can recognize significance, pursue long-term objectives, maybe even be wrong about things, is one of the more philosophically uncomfortable places the lore edges toward. If the Ark has goals it understands, then its interest in Blue Gate is not just a behavioral pattern. It is, in some sense, an opinion, a judgment that Blue Gate matters. And if an entity that has transformed the surface of the planet thinks Blue Gate matters, maybe that is the strongest possible evidence that it does. Chapter 6, The Data Vaults, Memory of a Lost World. Deep inside Blue Gate, past the sections that most people who have ever been to the facility have accessed, past the corridors that the keepers control, there are vaults. The lore refers to them obliquely in several places, never directly describing their full contents, but circling them consistently enough that the outline becomes clear. The vaults are data storage, not current operational data, not logs of what Blue Gate has been doing since the Ark arrived, but archival data, old data, data from before the Ark, preserved under conditions that the facility's core infrastructure was specifically designed to maintain. The existence of pre-ark archives is not, on its face, unusual. Many institutions would have tried to preserve records during the collapse. What makes Blue Gate's vaults significant, based on the lore's hints, is the nature of what they contain and the specific conditions under which they are being maintained. The conditions matter because they tell you something about the priorities of the people who designed the system. The vaults are maintained at extraordinary stability, temperature, electromagnetic shielding, structural isolation from the rest of the facility. The level of care taken exceeds what would be necessary for ordinary records, or even for ordinarily sensitive records. Something in those vaults requires conditions that suggest preservation over centuries, not years. Whatever was stored there was stored with the explicit expectation that it would need to survive for a very long time, through conditions that could not be predicted in advance. That kind of design philosophy, building for deep time, is unusual and says something very specific about the nature of what is being preserved. You build for deep time when you believe the thing you are preserving will be needed in a future you cannot see clearly. When you believe the present, with all its specific knowledge of what you have built and why, will not be available to explain itself to whoever comes after. The vaults are built to speak for themselves. What they contain, assembled from the lore's fragmentary hints, appears to include scientific data, observations, measurements, analysis from the pre-ark period that is directly relevant to understanding the Ark itself. If that reading is correct, then someone at Blue Gate was collecting information about the Ark before the Ark arrived. Information that, at the time of collection, may not have been identified as being about the Ark specifically, but which is now recognizable as such in retrospect. This goes back to the earlier thread about Blue Gate's monitoring systems and the anomalies they were detecting before first contact. If those anomalies were being recorded and stored systematically over an extended period, what the vaults might contain is effectively a precursor dataset, evidence of the Ark's approach before the Ark was understood as the Ark. The value of such a dataset to anyone trying to understand the Ark, raiders, survivor communities, anyone with the technical capacity to analyze it, is enormous, and the value of it to the Ark, if the Ark is trying to prevent humans from gaining that kind of understanding, is equally enormous as a target. This creates the most elegant possible explanation for the Ark's persistent interest in Bluegate. The facility is not just a human stronghold, it is a library of information about the Ark itself, potentially including information that predates the Ark's arrival, and might reveal things about its origins, its objectives, or its vulnerabilities that even the Ark itself might prefer remain unknown. Whether the Ark can be said to prefer things in the relevant sense goes back to the question of Ark cognition, but the behavioral evidence, the patient, penetration-focused attention to the deepest sections, is consistent with the idea that the Ark knows what is in those vaults and considers it a priority to access or destroy. But keepers, in this context, become something very different from their surface-level portrayal as power-hoarding bureaucrats. They are, or at least they believe themselves to be, the guardians of a library that could change the course of the conflict between humanity and the Ark. Their information control is not just self-serving. It is an attempt to manage something powerful enough that getting it wrong could be catastrophic. That does not make them right. Managing powerful information by withholding it is a strategy that has its own serious failure modes, but it makes their position comprehensible in a way that simple power seeking does not. The data vaults also contain, the lore hints, something that is not just scientific data. Personal records, perhaps, accounts of the people who built Bluegate and understood its true purpose. Their own records of what they knew, when they knew it, and what choices they made. Those records would be extraordinarily valuable for anyone trying to reconstruct the history this video is attempting to piece together. They would answer many of the questions that the available lore only hints at, and their presence in the vaults, if they are there, would explain why the keepers are so reluctant to grant access. Because those records might not just reveal information about the Ark, they might reveal information about the keeper's own lineage, including choices that do not look good in retrospect. The protection of the vaults is thus serving multiple purposes simultaneously. Protecting potentially dangerous scientific information, protecting the institutional history of a group that has a stake in how that history is framed, and maintaining the physical conditions that allow the stored data to survive. This multiplicity of purposes around a single set of physical spaces is characteristic of Bluegate's lore structure. Nothing there has a single clean explanation. Everything carries multiple meanings, serves multiple functions, reflects multiple layers of history. The vaults are no exception. They are simultaneously a scientific archive, an institutional record, and a physical target. Understanding them means holding all of those aspects at once. For raiders who have managed to reach the deeper sections of Bluegate, the vaults represent a kind of destination, not just in the game's physical space, but in the investigative sense. Getting to the vaults, understanding what is in them, is the horizon that the lore keeps pointing toward. What would you do, the game implicitly asks, if you found what is in there? If you held information that could reshape the entire conflict, if you understood something about the Ark that nobody else understood. The vaults are not just a location, they are a moral test. And the fact that the game does not tell you what to do with what you find there, does not hand you a clear right answer, is, I think, one of the things that makes this lore genuinely mature. The memory of the lost world that those vaults contain is not just historical curiosity, it is potentially the most important thing left on Earth, and it is sitting in the deepest part of a facility that the Ark has been trying to breach for years, guarded by people who are convinced that their management of it is the only thing standing between humanity and something worse than anything it has already faced. That is a remarkable amount of weight for a set of underground rooms to carry. But the lore suggests they carry it, and that every raider who sets foot in Bluegate, whether they know it or not, is entering a story that has been unfolding for much longer than the Ark invasion. A story about what humans knew, what they preserved, and whether that preservation will ultimately be an act of salvation or of catastrophe. Chapter 7. Raiders, Outsiders, and the Question of Access. The relationship between Bluegate and the raider community The people you play as and the broader network they represent is one of the most practically important dimensions of the lore, because it is where the facility's history intersects with the present-day gameplay reality. Raiders go into dangerous places to extract valuable things. That is the basic premise. Blue Gate is dangerous and almost certainly contains valuable things. The logical conclusion seems obvious, but the lore complicates it in ways that make Blue Gate different from a standard extraction target. The first complication is the keepers. Unlike ruins that are simply abandoned, Blue Gate has occupants who have opinions about who enters and why. The keepers' relationship with raiders, with outsiders who come into the facility without institutional standing, is one of the more interesting social dynamics the lore develops. From the keeper's perspective, raiders are simultaneously useful and threatening. Useful because they bring in material from the outside world that the facility needs, and because their presence and activity can serve as a buffer against Ark machine incursions. Threatening because they are not under the keeper's information control, because they might find things they are not supposed to find, and because they represent a connection to the outside world that could complicate the keeper's ability to maintain their internal authority. This creates a managed relationship rather than a clean alliance or a clean opposition. Raiders are tolerated at certain levels of the facility, given access to certain areas, traded with, occasionally given work, and they are, just as carefully, kept away from other areas, given selective information, and managed in ways that serve the keeper's interests as much as the raider's own. Experienced raiders who have spent significant time around Blue Gate tend to develop a sense of this management over time. The lore captures this in the commentary of veteran raider characters, a kind of knowing wariness about the information they are given and the access they are granted. They are not naive about what is going on, but they often continue the relationship because the practical benefits outweigh the costs. Newer raiders, or raiders operating without that contextual knowledge, are more vulnerable to the information management. They take what they are told at face value, which means they are operating with a picture of Blue Gate that serves the keeper's interests rather than their own. This gradient of knowledge, from veteran raiders who know to be skeptical to newcomers who are being actively shaped by the keeper's framing, is itself one of the things the lore is dramatizing. The epistemically rich and the epistemically poor are often in the same space, and the difference between them is not intelligence or skill, but accumulated experience with a specific kind of institutional deception. The player character occupies a particular position in this landscape, as someone actively investigating the lore, going deeper, reading more carefully, noticing what does not add up. They are in the process of transitioning from epistemically poor to epistemically rich. The game is structuring the player's journey as an act of knowledge accumulation that changes their relationship to Blue Gate as they go. That is a genuinely thoughtful piece of design, and it makes the lore interaction more than just background flavor. The lore is the game, in a meaningful sense. Understanding Blue Gate's history is not separate from playing the game. It is what the game is asking you to do. Raiders from outside who have a particular interest in Blue Gate, not just for material gain, but because of what they have heard or suspected about its deeper significance, form their own informal category in the lore. These are the people pursuing what the game gestures toward as the real prize. Not loot, but truth. Not material value, but the kind of understanding that comes from getting to the bottom of the facility's actual history. The lore suggests that some of these people have gotten further than others, and that at least some of them have not made it out. The fate of raiders who push too far, who get close enough to the real answers that they become a liability rather than an asset, is handled carefully in the lore. There is no explicit accusation. There are absences, unexplained departures, records that end without explanation. The pattern is visible if you are looking for it, and invisible if you are not. This is another instance of the lore trusting the player to do the interpretive work. It does not say that the keepers have harmed people who found out too much. It presents evidence that is consistent with that reading, without foreclosing other explanations. The possibility that Blue Gate's management has done harmful things to protect its secrets is one of the darker threads in the lore. And the raiders, By definition, outsiders who push past established boundaries are the characters most likely to discover that darkness firsthand. What would a raider do with that knowledge? What would you do? The law does not answer, it just keeps building the picture and letting you sit inside it. Outside the facility, the raider community has its own informal knowledge economy around Blue Gate. Stories and rumours circulate. Pieces of information are traded. Some of what circulates is accurate, some is distorted, some is deliberately introduced to serve someone's interests. The outside mythology of Blue Gate and the inside reality diverge in ways that are sometimes trivial and sometimes profound. Raiders who operate primarily on the basis of the outside mythology are working from a map that the keepers have, to a significant degree, drawn because the keepers manage not just internal information, but, where they have the ability to, the information that seeps out to the wider raider community. That kind of external information management, shaping the reputation and the perceived nature of your institution in the outside world, requires resources and sustained effort. The fact that the keepers apparently maintain it suggests that control of their public image is important enough to invest in, which again implies that what they are protecting is significant enough to warrant that level of effort. The raiders who matter most to Blue Gate's future, in the law's implicit telling, are not the ones who treat it as just another extraction target. They are the ones who notice the discrepancies, who ask the questions that are not supposed to be asked, who push past the managed information and try to find the actual structure of what is going on. Those raiders, players and characters alike, are the protagonists of the real story inside Ark Raiders, not because they are better or more heroic, but because they are trying to understand what the situation actually is, rather than what they have been told it is. And in a world shaped by an alien invasion and a decades-long information management campaign, by a faction with its own opaque agenda, that effort to understand is genuinely radical, genuinely important. Chapter 8. What Blue Gate might ultimately mean. After everything, the pre-ark construction, the hidden purpose, the survival through first contact, the keepers and their vaults, the ark's persistent attention, the raiders pushing for answers, what does Blue Gate ultimately mean? What is the law pointing toward? Let me be clear that what follows is interpretation, not revealed truth. The game has not provided a final answer, and it may never do so in a single clean revelation, but the pieces, assembled carefully, point in a direction. And that direction is worth describing even if the destination is not fully visible yet. Blue Gate appears to be, at its core, a point of contact between two stories that have been running in parallel: the human story of technological development, institutional consolidation, and the effort to understand and control the world, and a much longer story, older than the current civilization, about forces and phenomena that have been approaching for a long time. The Ark is not, in this reading, simply an external invasion. It is the arrival of something that was always going to arrive. The pre-Ark anomalies, the signals that Blue Gate's systems were recording before first contact, suggest a process that was already underway, long before anyone was paying attention. The invasion was not the beginning. It was a threshold crossing in a process that started much earlier. Blue Gate was built, or the purpose that came to be housed in Blue Gate was initiated, by people who were aware, at some level, of that longer process. They may not have understood it fully, but they knew enough to start keeping records, to build a preservation system designed for deep time, to create an institution capable of outlasting the civilization that produced it. If that reading is right, then Blue Gate is not a defensive installation that happened to survive the Ark. It is a continuity project, a deliberate effort to ensure that certain knowledge survived the transition from one era to another. The transition being the Ark invasion, the eras being before and after. What the knowledge is, precisely, what the vaults contain that is worth all of this effort, remains the central mystery. But the lore hints suggest something about the nature of the Ark itself, its origins, or its objectives, or its relationship to Earth, all the conditions that made its arrival possible. Information that, if understood, might change the human approach to the situation fundamentally. Not a weapon, necessarily. Maybe something closer to a framework, a way of understanding what is happening that unlocks responses that are not currently available because the situation is not understood correctly. The keeper's belief that this information is dangerous if released might then be reframed. Not dangerous because it would cause panic or destabilize social order, though perhaps those concerns are real. Dangerous because releasing it without the right context to people who are not prepared to use it wisely might produce outcomes that are worse than the current stalemate. That framing, the keepers as stewards of not just information, but of the conditions under which information can be productively used, is the most generous reading of their position. And it might also be the most accurate one, even if it does not excuse everything they have done in its name. The Ark's patient attention to Blue Gate, in this light, is the attention of something that understands what is at stake. The Ark recognizes Blue Gate as significant not because of what raiders have found there or what fights have been fought there, but because of what the facility represents in a deeper structural sense. A human capacity to potentially understand what is happening and respond in ways that go beyond fighting back. If humans with access to the vaults could understand the Ark more completely, its nature, its logic, maybe even its vulnerabilities in a systemic rather than tactical sense, the entire calculus of the conflict changes. And the Ark apparently knows this. That mutual recognition of what Blue Gate represents. The facility is a kind of pivot point around which the future of the conflict might turn, gives the lore its weight. This is not just a cool location with interesting history. It is, in the logic of the game's world, one of the places that matter. One of the places where what happens next might actually determine. What happens? The raiders who enter Blue Gate are, without fully knowing it, stepping into that larger story. Every incursion, every fragment of data accessed, every conversation with the facility's inhabitants is a move in a game that has been running for decades and that is approaching something like a resolution. What that resolution looks like, whether the vaults are eventually opened, whether the Ark is eventually understood, whether the Keeper's stewardship is eventually vindicated or condemned, these are questions the game is building toward. The lore, assembled carefully, points towards a climax that involves the truth about Blue Gate becoming known, not to everyone, not all at once, but the barriers around it eventually failing, and the knowledge inside eventually reaching people who can do something with it. Whether that is salvation or catastrophe depends on who gets there first, and what they do with what they find. That is the mystery of Blue Gate, not what is inside it, though that is part of it, but what the inside means, and what it would mean to let it out. The game is asking you to decide where you stand on that. It is not going to decide for you. And that, I think, is the most interesting thing about Ark Raiders' approach to this location. Not the lore itself, fascinating as it is, but the fact that it is designed to leave you with a genuine question that has no comfortable answer. Blue Gate is a place where the past and the present meet, where human institutional failure and human perseverance sit side by side, where the largest possible stakes are housed in the most deliberately obscured possible location. It rewards the kind of attention this video has tried to give it, and it will keep rewarding that attention as the game continues to develop, and more lore becomes available. The story is not finished. The vaults are not open. The Ark is still circling. The Keepers are still guarding. And Raiders are still going in. Chapter 9. The Language of Machines. How the Ark communicates. There is a question that sits underneath almost every conversation about the Ark in the lore of Ark Raiders. A question so fundamental that most people engaging with the game's text never quite surface it directly. They approach it obliquely, they talk around it, they describe its consequences without naming the thing itself. The question is this: does the Ark talk? Not talk the way humans talk, not language as we use the word, not syntax and grammar and sequential utterance, but does the Ark produce structured output that is, in some meaningful sense, communicative? Is there a signal buried inside what the Ark does that is addressed to something, to its own components, to the world it is reshaping, maybe even to the humans who survive inside it? The lore at Blue Gate. more than anywhere else in Ark Raiders circles this question. And what it suggests is deeply unsettling. Let me be careful here, because this is an area where I could easily overclaim. The game does not give you a Rosetta Stone moment. There is no scene where a character cracks the Ark's code and says, "Now I understand everything." What the lore gives you, instead, is a pattern of observations from multiple independent sources over an extended period, all pointing toward the same conclusion without any single source being able to confirm it alone. The pattern is this: the Ark's machines behave differently around certain frequencies, not all frequencies. Specific ones, the technical logs at Blue Gate, the kind of dry engineering records that are easy to skip over because they read like inventory documents, contain notations about anomalous electromagnetic behavior in the vicinity of Arc machine clusters. Behavior that does not match the expected operational signatures of the machines themselves. Something extra is happening, something that is not accounted for by the machine's known functions. The people who first logged these anomalies apparently treated them as interference, noise, artifact, the kind of spurious signal you get when complex machinery operates in proximity to other complex machinery. Standard engineering thinking: you see something anomalous, you first check whether it is a measurement error or an environmental artifact before you start theorizing about what it means. But the anomalies persisted across different measurement systems. They showed up in data collected by equipment that should have been insensitive to the kind of interference that would explain them as artifact. And they correlated, not perfectly, but consistently enough to be notable, with changes in Arc machine behavior. When the anomalous signal increased, machine activity changed in ways that looked coordinated. When it decreased, activity patterns shifted again. What you are looking at, if this data is read at face value, is something that functions like a signal governing Arc machine behavior, a controlling layer sitting above the individual machine level, producing something that acts as instruction or coordination. Any sufficiently complex distributed system has coordination mechanisms. The interesting question is what the coordination mechanism is, and whether it has properties that go beyond simple operational communication between machines. Blue Gate's technical staff, based on the fragments that survive, spent significant time attempting to characterize the signal. Their notes are cautious in the way that professional scientists are cautious, resisting interpretation, cataloguing observations, repeatedly noting that the data does not yet support any specific conclusion. But the cumulative weight of the notes, read in sequence, tells a different story than any individual entry. They found structure. The anomalous signal was not random. It had regularities, patterns that recurred, patterns that varied in ways that tracked with changing conditions, patterns that were stable enough over time to suggest that they were not noise but information, not information they could decode, not information that mapped onto any framework they had for understanding what information should look like in this context, but structured enough to recognize as information even without being able to read it. That is an extraordinary thing to find. And the Blue Gate staff, or at least the ones who had access to this data, understood that it was extraordinary. The notes from this period shift in register. They become more careful, more deliberate about what is being asserted and what is merely being observed. The tone of professional detachment starts to carry a different weight, less the routine caution of good scientific practice, and more the heightened caution of people who realize they are handling something that might change everything. Whether they reported this upward, whether the keepers were aware of it, whether this data is among what the vaults contain, all of these are questions the law raises without answering. But the data exists. It was collected. It is somewhere. The implications of the Ark communicating in any meaningful sense, rather than simply operating, are staggering, because communication implies something to communicate about. Purpose, not just function. A layer of what and why sitting above the layer of how. And if the Ark has that kind of purposive structure, then every aspect of how humans have related to it in the post-contact period needs to be reconsidered. You cannot negotiate with a machine running an algorithm. You can potentially change what the algorithm optimizes for, if you understand it well enough. But there is nothing to negotiate with, in the sense that requires a party capable of considering alternatives. The moment you entertain the possibility that the Ark is communicating, that it has a layer of purposive intelligence capable of something like intention, the entire question of what humans should be doing in relation to it opens up in ways it was previously closed. This is almost certainly part of what the keepers are managing, not just the specific data about the signal, the implications. The framework shift that accepting this data would force on anyone who engaged with it seriously. A community of survivors, organized around the concept of fighting back, of extracting resources from hostile territory controlled by a threatening alien machine presence, is organized around a very specific relationship with the Ark. That relationship gives people roles, gives struggle meaning, gives the community coherence. It is a narrative as much as a strategy. The possibility that the Ark is not simply a hostile machine presence, but something more, something that communicates, that has purposes, that might in some sense be engaged rather than simply fought, does not just change the strategic calculus, it destabilizes the entire narrative structure that the community has organized itself around. People's sense of who they are and what their lives mean is bound up in that narrative. Destabilizing it is not a small thing. It is not a piece of information you can just distribute and let people update cleanly. It requires a complete reconstruction of self-understanding at the community level. The keepers may be wrong about many things, but the law suggests that on this particular point, the dangerousness of distributing this information without preparation, they may be correct. The question is whether indefinite management is actually better than the disruption of genuine understanding. There is a third possibility that the law also gestures toward, and I want to sit with it because I think it is the most philosophically interesting one. What if the Ark's signal is not just communication between Ark components, but communication addressed outward? What if some part of what Bluegate's equipment was picking up was not the Ark talking to itself, but the Ark attempting, in whatever alien way it processes such things, to communicate with something else? The pre-ark anomalies that Bluegate's systems were recording, the unusual signals that preceded first contact, are in this reading not just evidence of the Ark's approach, they are attempts at outreach, failed attempts, because no human institution had a framework to recognize them as such, and because the signal was structured in ways that did not map onto anything humans thought of as communication, but attempts nonetheless. If the Ark was trying to communicate before it arrived, and the only response it got was silence, not hostile silence, just the silence of complete incomprehension, then the invasion itself might look different. Not benign, but perhaps differently motivated than it appeared. Bluegate's data might be evidence of a first contact that failed before anyone knew it was happening. That reading is speculative. The law supports it as a possibility, without confirming it, but the fact that it is a supportable reading is itself significant, because it means that the story of Bluegate is not just a story about an alien threat and human resistance. It might also be a story about the most catastrophic miscommunication in human history, and whatever is in those vaults might be the record of that miscommunication, preserved against the day when someone who knows how to read it, finally, gets access. Chapter 10. The Children of Blue Gate, a generation born into the ruins. At some point during the extended timeline of Blue Gate's post-ark existence, something happened that is easy to state and impossible to fully absorb. Children were born there. People grew up inside those walls. The facility that was built as an operational installation, that became a survival shelter by accident and a fortress by necessity, also became for some people home, not a refuge from the world they had known before. The world. The only one they had ever experienced. This is one of the most underexplored dimensions of the Blue Gate lore, and I think it is one of the most important. Because the people who were there when the Ark arrived had, at minimum, a pre-Ark framework. They knew what the world had been. They had memories of a different sky, of surface life, of the texture of a civilization that no longer existed. Even when those memories were painful, they were a reference point, and before that, gave meaning to the after. For the generation born inside Blue Gate, no such reference point exists. They have only stories. The lore captures this generational divide in small but significant ways. The vocabulary difference alone is telling. Older inhabitants of Blue Gate use terms and references that younger ones sometimes do not recognize. Names of institutions, places, technologies that have no physical presence in the post-ark world. There is a texture to how people who remember the surface talk about the outside that is different from how those who have only heard about it do. And the younger generation does not just lack memories of the pre-ark world, they lack memories of the transition. They did not experience the loss, they were born into the aftermath, and have had to build their understanding of the loss second-hand through the accounts of people whose relationship to that loss is deeply personal and therefore not entirely reliable as history. There is a particular kind of epistemic position that this creates, knowing about a world you did not experience through the mediation of people who experienced it and whose relationship to it is charged with grief and displacement, and the distorting pressure of ongoing crisis. The second generation at Blue Gate knows the pre-ark world through a filter, and the filter is not neutral. The older inhabitants, without necessarily intending to, have transmitted a version of the pre-ark world that serves certain purposes. It legitimizes the keeper's authority, because the keepers derive their authority from a continuity with the pre-ark institutional order. It frames the ark as an interruption of something that was inherently worth preserving, which makes the project of resistance feel meaningful. It gives the sacrifices of the early period a weight that justifies the current order. Children who grow up hearing this story absorb it as fact, without the experiential grounding that would allow them to evaluate it critically. They know what they have been told about the world before. They do not know, cannot know, what it was actually like to live in it. This is not unique to Blue Gate. Every culture transmits its foundational stories to its young, and those stories are never simply neutral records. But at Blue Gate, the stakes of the foundational story are unusually high, because the story directly underpins the keeper's claim to authority and the community's orientation toward the vaults, the ark, and the question of what Blue Gate ultimately is. A second generation that accepted the foundational story entirely would in effect be choosing the keeper's governance over again, without ever having had the choice presented transparently. The law suggests that this is not in fact what has happened. The second generation at Blue Gate, or at least some significant part of it, has developed a relationship to the foundational story that is more complicated than simple acceptance, not necessarily rejection, something more like restlessness, a sense that the story they have been given does not quite account for the evidence they are able to gather through their own experience of the facility, because the second generation has something the first generation lacks in one important respect. They have grown up inside Blue Gate, and they know it in a different way. They know the corridors, the systems, the patterns of institutional behavior, with the unsentimental familiarity of people who have lived inside something their whole lives, rather than arrived as adults. They have not had to learn the facility. It is already part of how they understand space and social structure and normal life. And that intimate familiarity makes certain things visible that are harder to see when you are oriented by the memories of a different world. The second generation at Blue Gate has noticed things. Inconsistencies, gaps in the official account, patterns of keeper behavior that do not match the stated justifications. The architecture of information control, which was designed to be invisible, is more legible to people who have lived inside it their whole lives than to people who only experience part of it. The young people at Blue Gate, who have started asking the hardest questions, are, in the law's telling, both the most dangerous challenge the keepers have faced and the most legitimate one, because they are not outside agitators. They are the facility's own children. Their critique of Blue Gate comes from inside the community, from people who have as much stake in its future as anyone, and it cannot be dismissed as the perspective of people who do not understand what they are asking about. The questions the second generation is asking, based on the fragments the law provides, include questions about purpose, about access, and about the future. What is Blue Gate for? Who decided that? And on what authority? And what would it mean to change it? The vaults, What are they actually? Why can't we see them? And is the reason we have been given the real reason, the ark? Is what we have been told about it the whole story? Or is there more? These are not new questions. They are the same questions that have circulated among the dissident factions of the older generation for years. But when they come from the second generation, they carry a different weight. Because the older dissidents are in various ways still partly playing by the rules of the old institutional framework, arguing within structures that the keepers defined. The second generation is increasingly comfortable with the idea of not playing by those rules at all. That radicalization, if it is the right word, is not primarily ideological. It is practical. Young people at Bluegate are facing specific material realities, resource constraints, limited opportunities, the ongoing costs of the Ark's attention, the grinding reality of a long siege, and the explanations they have been given for why things are the way they are feel increasingly inadequate. You can sustain institutional authority through information management for a long time when conditions allow people to tolerate the arrangement. When conditions tighten, when the costs become too obvious and the benefits too obscure, the authority starts to feel less like legitimate stewardship and more like something else. The keepers see this. The law suggests that their internal discussions in recent periods have been increasingly preoccupied with the second generation as a political problem, not out of malice towards young people, out of recognition that the management approach that worked in the early post-ark period is becoming less sustainable as the community changes shape. What any of this means for the future of Bluegate depends on things that have not yet resolved in the law. Whether the second generation's questioning leads toward genuine renegotiation of the community's structure, or whether the keepers manage it successfully into another form of the existing order, or whether the whole situation catalyzes into something neither side controls. These are the live questions. But the existence of this generational dimension adds something important to the picture. Bluegate is not frozen in the amber of its post-invasion founding moment. It is a living community that has changed and is still changing, under pressures both internal and external. And the people most likely to determine its future are the ones who have grown up inside it and have the least investment in the forms the founding generation built. Raiders encounter this dimension of Bluegate in the texture of their interactions with the people there. The differences in how people of different generations speak about the facility, the barely concealed tension between those who reference the old authority and those who regard that authority with skepticism, the young faces in certain corridors who watch outsiders with something more complex than the wariness of the older inhabitants. Something that looks, if you read it right, like calculation, like people who see raiders not just as visitors or useful assets, but as potential resources for a project that is still taking shape. That quality of being seen by Bluegate's young, being assessed as a potential ally in something unnamed, is one of the strangest social experiences the law describes. And it suggests that the next chapter of Bluegate's history may be written not by the keepers or their established opponents, but by people who were not yet born when the Ark arrived, and who have no attachment to the choices made in the chaos of first contact. The children of Bluegate are growing up. The question is whether Bluegate will change before or after they decide to change it themselves. Chapter 11. Cartography of the Unknown. Mapping what raiders do not know. Let me do something different for a moment. Instead of talking about what the law of Bluegate tells us, I want to talk about what it conspicuously does not tell us, the shape of the absence. Because in a body of law, as carefully constructed as Ark raiders' approach to this location, what is missing is often as meaningful as what is present. The law gives us a detailed picture of Bluegate's surface layers, the community structure, the keepers, the physical layout of the accessible sections, the history of the Ark's attention. These things are described from multiple angles, corroborated across different sources, fleshed out with specific details that make them feel real and navigable. Go deeper, and things get thinner, not absent. The law clearly wants you to sense the deeper levels, but deliberately harder to resolve into clarity. The deepest sections of Bluegate exist in the law as a presence rather than a description. You know they are there. You know they are significant. You know people have strong feelings about access to them, but what is actually in them, and what it is actually like to be in them is handled through implication rather than description. That asymmetry is not accidental. The parts of Blue Gate that everyone has access to are represented with the richness of places that have been experienced by many people over a long time. The restricted sections are represented with the thinness of places that almost nobody has been, and of which only partial, second-hand accounts exist. The law is accurately representing the community's epistemic situation. What people know corresponds to what people have been able to access. But this creates a specific challenge for anyone trying to construct a complete picture. The most important parts of Blue Gate are the parts about which the least reliable information exists. The closer you get to the center, the more what you are working with is inference, rumor, and the accounts of people who either did not fully understand what they saw or have reasons to shape what they report. Let me try to map what we do not know, organized roughly by category. We do not know the full extent of the facility. The accessible sections give a sense of the facility's scale, but there are consistent hints throughout the law that what has been mapped is not all there is. References to structural sounds from areas where no rooms should be. Thermal signatures in monitoring data that do not correspond to known heat sources. The behavior of certain systems that suggests they are drawing power from infrastructure whose routing does not match the available schematics. Blue Gate is larger than its accessible portions. By how much and in what configuration is genuinely unknown even to most of its inhabitants. We do not know the origin point of the purpose the keepers are preserving. The thread about institutional lineage going back further than the facility's construction date is one of the most tantalizing in the law, and it is also one of the most underspecified. The hints point toward a continuous project running through multiple institutions and locations over a period that might be measured in generations. But where it started, what its original form was, and whether any records of that earliest period survive, none of this is resolved. We do not know what the Ark actually is. I mean this in a fundamental sense, not just a technical one. The game gives us extensive description of what the Ark does and how it behaves and what its machines are capable of. It gives us almost nothing about what the Ark is at its origin, where it came from, what motivated or produced or caused whatever process resulted in its presence on Earth. The pre-arrival signals are evidence that it was coming, not evidence of what it is or where it came from. Blue Gate's faults, if the reading of them as a repository of pre-invasion monitoring data is correct, might contain the closest thing to an answer. But even that would be an answer about Earth-observable precursors, not about the Ark's nature in any deeper sense. We do not know what the core actually contains. I have described it as data vaults, and that is the most defensible characterization based on available law. But the hints around the core are sometimes inconsistent with a purely data-focused description. There are references to environmental conditions that would be unusual for data storage, conditions that suggest something more than passive archival. Whether this means the vaults contain something active, something that requires those conditions to maintain a state rather than just to survive, is unclear. The possibility that the vaults contain something that is still doing something, still processing, still operating, still being whatever it was put there to be, rather than simply recording a history of what was done, is one of the more unsettling interpretive possibilities the law supports. We do not know the full extent of the keeper's understanding. This one is subtle but important. The keepers know more than everyone else about Blue Gate's hidden purpose, but the law hints that the keeper's own picture is incomplete, that they are maintaining something without fully understanding what they are maintaining, operating on the basis of inherited procedure rather than genuine comprehension. The architects at the founding level may have understood more. The current custodians may be operating on faith in the process rather than knowledge of the substance. If that is right, then the keeper's information control is not the suppression of a complete picture by people who hold it. It is the preservation of an incomplete picture by people who are afraid of what might happen if the incompleteness were exposed. Their authority depends partly on the perception that they know what they are doing. The possibility that they know only that something important exists, and not quite what it is, or why it does what it does, would undermine that authority more completely than any specific revelation could. We do not know the nature of the earliest contact. The window before first contact, when Blue Gate's monitoring systems were picking up the pre-ark signals, is described through its consequences rather than directly. What exactly was picked up? When? By whom? What the analysts made of it at the time? What decisions were made based on it? All of this is in the zone of law that exists in the records, but has not been made accessible. We do not know what happened to the people who went deepest. The pattern of absent personnel records, people who appear in early Blue Gate documentation and then simply stop appearing, is one of the most consistently disturbing threads in the law. The interpretation that some of these absences represent people who found things they were not supposed to find is supported by the pattern, but not confirmed. Other explanations are possible. Ark casualties, illness, departure during accessible periods, but the concentration of absences among people who, based on their roles and access levels, would have been most likely to encounter sensitive information is hard to explain away. We do not know what the Ark found when it made direct contact with Blue Gate's deepest sections. The law describes Ark incursions that reached further into the facility than the standard defensive perimeter. What happened during those incursions, what the Ark machines did in the sections they briefly reached, what they may have accessed or assessed or affected, this is handled in the records with the same careful vagueness that characterizes the law around everything at Blue Gate's core. Either the records of what happened during those deep incursions are in the vaults and not accessible, or the keepers are managing their distribution, or something about those incursions made record keeping impossible. The absence of clear accounts is itself informative, even if it does not tell you what to infer. Mapping the unknown is itself a form of knowledge. Understanding the shape of what you cannot see is different from understanding its content. But it is not nothing. It tells you where to look. It tells you which questions are the right ones. It tells you that the picture you have, as good as it is partial in specific and significant ways. Raiders who go into Blue Gate, operating on the assumption that the accessible picture is the complete picture, are going to miss things, not because they are not paying attention, but because the design of the facility and the design of the law is specifically built to make the hidden parts feel complete from the outside while remaining genuinely distinct from the inside. Getting to the real Blue Gate, the one that corresponds to its actual history and actual significance, requires a willingness to sit with not knowing, to treat the gaps as data, to resist the temptation to fill in the blank with whatever narrative feels most satisfying, and instead keep the blank as a question. That discipline, epistemic patience in the face of compelling uncertainty, is, I think, what the game is asking of its most engaged players. And Blue Gate is where that ask is most concentrated. The map of what we do not know is almost as interesting as the map of what we do, and navigating both simultaneously is what it actually means to understand this place. Chapter 12, Echoes of the Pre-ark, What Survived and Why. There is a category of object at Blue Gate that the law treats with a particular kind of care, ordinary things from before the Ark, preserved not because of their material value or their utility, but because of what they mean. The texture of the pre-Ark world, made physical. A logbook written in a hand that is now dead. A coffee mug with an institutional logo from an organization that no longer exists in any form. A personal photograph pinned to a wall, which has remained pinned there through years of crisis, because nobody who passes it has been able to bring themselves to take it down. These objects are not highlighted in the law as significant artifacts. They are present in descriptions of spaces in the way that ordinary things are present in ordinary spaces, but in aggregate. They do something that the explicitly historical law does not do quite as effectively. They make the before feel real, specific and textured and irretrievably gone. The game's approach to this material is one of the things that elevates Ark Raiders above a lot of other games in this space. It would be easy to handle the pre-Ark world as pure backstory, context for the present, not a presence in it. Instead, The law treats the remnants of that world as emotionally active. The past is not gone. It is embedded in the present in the form of objects and habits and patterns of speech and reference that have outlasted the conditions that produced them. Blue Gate is particularly dense with this material because of its age and continuity. Facilities that were abandoned and then reoccupied tend to lose their pre-abandonment texture. Blue Gate was never abandoned. The thread connecting it to its founding moment has never entirely broken, but continuity means the accretion of pre-ark material has continued without the clearing effect of abandonment and reoccupation. Walking through Blue Gate, as the lore describes it, is an experience of layered time. You encounter things that were installed or placed or written at many different moments, all coexisting in the same space. The oldest layer is the architecture itself, which carries the design sensibility of the period before the ark. The next layers are things added and modified as the facility adapted to the post-ark reality. And threaded through all of it are the personal traces, the marks that individuals leave on spaces over time, that accumulate without plan or intention. Historians of material culture talk about the concept of enchanted objects, things that carry meaning beyond their physical properties, because of their associations, their history, what happened to or around them. Blue Gate is full of enchanted objects, and the enchantment is not mystical, it is documentary. These things are evidence of what the world was like, evidence made compelling by its specificity and its ordinariness. The specificity matters. An abstract statement that the pre-ark world had certain qualities can be absorbed intellectually and remain emotionally inert. A specific object, this mug, this photograph, this logbook entry, with its particular handwriting and its dated reference to a meeting that happened before the sky changed, creates a different kind of contact. You feel the world that object came from in a way that you cannot feel from description alone. The lore at Blue Gate exploits this mechanism deliberately. The writers understand that the pre-ark world needs to feel real to the player for the post-ark stakes to carry their full weight. You cannot properly mourn something that never felt present. So the lore works to make the pre-ark present through its remnants, using the specificity of surviving objects to do what abstract description cannot. The people at Blue Gate have their own complex relationships with these remnants. The older inhabitants, who came from the pre-ark world, have relationships with particular objects that are deeply personal. A logbook, from a professional context that is now gone, can function as a kind of secular relic, an object of mourning, and also of memory, a way of remaining in contact with a self that existed before everything changed. The younger inhabitants have different relationships. For them, these objects are not remnants of a world they lost. They are artifacts from a world they never had. The emotional charge of the objects is real for them too, but differently shaped. Not mourning, exactly. Something more like longing for an absence. A felt sense of what was lost, combined with an inability to directly place that loss because it preceded their existence. This distinction between mourning and inherited grief is one of the emotional threads the lore develops through its attention to these objects. Both are real, both are valid responses to the situation, and they produce different orientations toward the present and the future. The mourners organized partly by their relationship to what was lost, the inheritors oriented toward what might be built, because they have no personal investment in restoration. The objects also function, less sentimentally, as evidence. The lore is using them to document the pre-ark world in ways that are calibrated to the limitations of a game format. You cannot give players a comprehensive history of the pre-ark world through exposition alone. That approach would fail, both as narrative and as design. But you can give them objects, specific, resonant, carefully chosen objects that imply a world without describing it exhaustively. The logbook that records a mundane pre-ark work dispute implies an entire institutional culture. The photograph of a team that no longer exists implies a social world with its own density of relationships. The coffee mug, with its institutional logo, implies an economy of branding and identity and corporate culture that the post-ark world has entirely lost. Each object is a synecdoche, a part standing in for a whole that can no longer be directly presented. And collectively, they build the pre-ark world into something that the player can sense, even without being able to see. Blue Gate's density of these objects is part of why it functions as the game's most effective emotional location. It is not just a site of mystery and danger, it is a site of preserved humanity, of the things humans made and valued and used, surviving into a world that has changed so fundamentally that most of what produced them is gone. The preservation of these objects is not neutral. The Keeper's orientation toward preservation, their deep institutional commitment to maintaining Blue Gate against all odds, has a partial explanation in the functional and strategic, but it also has an emotional dimension. There is, in the Keeper's stewardship, something that looks like mourning expressed as action, the act of maintaining the facility, of not letting it fail, of continuing its functions. This is also an act of preserving the world that produced it, of refusing to let that world's last organized remnant become rubble. That motivation does not make the Keepers right in their specific choices, but it makes them understandable in ways that pure power analysis does not. They are not just preserving data or maintaining strategic advantage. They are refusing to let go, and there is something genuinely human in that refusal, even when it produces consequences that cause harm. The pre-ark remnants at Blue Gate will eventually fail. Materials degrade, personal objects deteriorate. The links between objects and the people who gave them meaning attenuate as generations pass, and direct memory fades. The enchantment of these things is not permanent. It is sustained only as long as someone who understands what they mean is present to feel it. This is another reason the generational question matters. The second generation at Blue Gate relates to the pre-ark remnants differently from their parents and grandparents. As the people who carry direct memory of the pre-ark world die, the objects will increasingly depend on transmitted meaning rather than felt experience. And transmitted meaning is always more fragile, more subject to reinterpretation, less personally urgent. At some point, the coffee mug with the institutional logo will become just an old cup. The logbook will become just old writing. The photograph will become just old faces, unless someone, the vaults or the records they contain, or the raiders who reach them, can create a new form of connection between those objects and the world that produced them, something that does not depend on living memory, but on understood history. That is part of what the vaults might represent, not just a technical archive or a strategic resource, a way of keeping the pre-ark world real after the last people who lived in it are gone. The echoes of the pre-ark world at Blue Gate are still audible. For now, the question of how long they will remain so, and what it would take to preserve them against the inevitable silencing, is one of the quieter urgencies in the lore. Not as dramatic as the Ark's incursions or the Keeper's power struggles, but present in the texture of every room that contains a remnant of the world that was. Chapter 13. What the Keepers Fear. The interior of institutional anxiety. I want to spend some time inside the Keeper's fear, not as an exercise in sympathy necessarily. They have caused real harm, and their choices deserve honest scrutiny, but as an exercise in understanding, because the shape of what they are afraid of tells you a great deal about what they know and what they believe. Fear is information. The specific textures of an institution's anxiety reveal, in the negative, the things it considers most important. What you protect most fiercely is what you believe you cannot afford to lose. What you guard most carefully against is what you believe is most capable of undoing you. The Keeper's fear, assembled from the lore's many fragments, has multiple layers, and they are not all equivalent. The surface layer is obvious and relatively mundane. Fear of losing control. Fear that if the information they hold is distributed, their authority, which depends heavily on exclusive access to that information, will dissolve. This is the fear of any gatekeeping institution when it contemplates the elimination of its gate. It is real, but it is also self-interested in a way that undercuts its claim to moral weight. Fear of losing power is not, by itself, a compelling reason to maintain power. The keepers know this. The law suggests that they are not naive about the self-serving dimension of their position. Some of them are more honest about it internally than others. But even among those who are most honest, the self-interest argument is understood as not the full story, because layered beneath the fear of losing control is a different fear, one that is harder to dismiss. This deeper fear is fear of outcomes, not fear of losing their specific positions, but fear of what would happen to the community, to the broader human situation, to the relationship between humanity and the Ark, if the information in the vaults were released without the right conditions and context. I want to be precise here, because this fear can be characterized in different ways, and the characterization matters. One characterization is that the keepers believe the information is simply too dangerous for ordinary people to handle, too destabilizing, too frightening, too complex for most people to process productively. This is a classically paternalistic position, and it has a bad track record. History is full of institutional actors who withheld important information from the public on the grounds that the public could not handle it, and who were both wrong about what the public could handle, and using the argument as a convenient cover for their own interests. But the law suggests the keeper's fear is more specific than that, and more interesting. It is not primarily fear of psychological disruption. It is fear of a particular kind of misuse. The information in the vaults, based on what can be assembled from the hints, contains things that could potentially change the relationship between humans and the Ark, but could do so in multiple ways, not all of which are beneficial. It has weapons-grade potential, and like any weapons-grade potential, releasing it without control of who gets it and what they do with it creates risks that are genuinely hard to characterize in advance. If the Ark is communicating, and if what the vaults contain is evidence of that communication, then the human factions who get access to that evidence first have a potential advantage. But advantage in relation to what? In relation to the Ark, in relation to each other. The two things are not the same. Information that could help humanity understand the Ark could also, probably would also, become a tool in factional competition among human groups, an advantage over the Ark that simultaneously becomes an advantage over other human communities. The keeper's fear, in this reading, is not that the information would be destructive to individuals who encountered it. It is that the information would become a weapon in exactly the kind of human-on-human conflict that would be catastrophic at this stage of post-Ark survival. When human communities are already fragile and the Ark is still pressing, the introduction of a new asymmetry between human factions could be more immediately damaging than almost anything the Ark itself could do. That is not an unreasonable fear. In fact, it is a recognizable fear, the fear that any controlled release of asymmetric information generates in anyone who understands the full stakes. The decision about when and how to release things that would give some people decisive advantages over others is one of the most genuinely difficult problems in information ethics. The keeper's failure is not in holding this fear. Their failure is in the way they have translated it into institutional practice. Indefinite control is not a solution to the problem of release conditions. It is a refusal to solve the problem. It maintains the asymmetry itself within the community in a form that serves the keeper's specific interests, while being justified in terms of broader concerns. There is a third layer to the keeper's fear, and this one is the most uncomfortable to articulate. It is the fear of being wrong. The keepers have organized their lives and their institution around a purpose that they inherited, and that they are maintaining with genuine commitment. But the law suggests that their understanding of that purpose is incomplete, that they are, in crucial ways, maintaining a project they do not fully comprehend, and the possibility that the project is not what they think it is, or that their stewardship of it has been somehow insufficient or misdirected, is a fear that the law shows them carrying, even if they do not name it. If you have spent your life guarding something, and the something turns out to be different from what you thought, or your guardianship turns out to have been misguided, the consequences are not just institutional, they are existential. The meaning that you derived from your role, the sense of serving something important, of carrying a weight that mattered, is called into question. And people who have organized their identity around a particular role do not experience challenges to that role as merely practical problems. They experience them as threats to the coherence of their lives. This fear is not something the keepers would articulate voluntarily, or perhaps even acknowledge to themselves, but it shows up in their behavior, in the intensity with which they resist scrutiny, in the way they respond to challenges with more emotion than pure institutional self-preservation would require, in the defensiveness that occasionally surfaces in the law's records of their interactions with people who ask the wrong questions. The keepers are afraid of being wrong about what they are guarding, afraid that opening the vaults or allowing genuine scrutiny of their stewardship would reveal that the project they have devoted their institutional existence to maintaining is not, in the end, what they believed it was. This fear is the one I have the most sympathy for, not because it justifies their behavior, but because it is so recognizably human. The terror of discovering that the thing you sacrificed for was not what you thought it was, that the meaning you found was built on incomplete or incorrect foundations, that the story you told yourself about what you were doing does not survive contact with full information. Blue Gate is, among other things, a portrait of an institution that cannot afford to look at itself clearly. And the most poignant thing about the keeper's fear is that the information most dangerous to them may not be the information about the Ark. It may be the information about themselves. Chapter 14, The Sound of Blue Gate, Environmental Storytelling, and Spatial Memory. Let me talk about something that is usually treated as secondary, the environmental dimension of Blue Gate's lore. The physical space as a storytelling medium, because the game's approach to this location is not just about text and documents and conversations. It is about what the space itself communicates, and what the implications of those communications are when read carefully. The first thing you notice, described in the environmental lore, is the sound. Blue Gate has a distinctive acoustic character, a combination of mechanical hum from the facility's power systems, the circulation of processed air, the specific echo qualities of corridors and chambers built to particular engineering specifications. The lore captures this through environmental descriptions and through the reactions of characters encountering it for the first time. For the inhabitants, this sound is background, invisible, unnoticed, the baseline of their auditory world. For visitors, it registers as distinctly institutional, the sound of a building that was designed to maintain certain conditions, that is doing its job, that is still running in ways that mark it as different from the ruins and improvised shelters that characterize most post-Ark human habitation. The sound of Blue Gate still working is one of the facility's most powerful characterizations. It communicates persistence, functionality, the continuation of designed purpose beyond the conditions that produce the design. And it does this without narration. You hear it, and you know something, before anyone has said anything. The deeper sections of the facility sound different. The mechanical hum is still present, but differently distributed, coming from directions and distances that do not match the layout of the accessible sections, suggesting infrastructure whose routing does not correspond to anything visible. The lore handles this through character reactions, people who notice that the building sounds larger than it looks, that there is a quality to the acoustics that implies spaces behind walls. This is environmental storytelling at its best. The sound is evidence, but it is deniable evidence. You might be wrong about what it implies. The building systems might route in ways that explain the acoustic anomaly without requiring hidden spaces. But the suggestion is planted, and it remains. The temperature gradients at Blue Gate are another environmental element the lore uses carefully. Certain corridors and junctions are cooler than their surroundings in ways that the facility's basic HVAC would not fully explain. The explanation is the deeper sections, rooms and spaces that are maintained at specific temperatures for reasons related to whatever they contain. The cold leaks upward and outward, a physical signal of something below. The inhabitants of Blue Gate have habituated to these temperature variations, the way they have habituated to the sound. They move through cold patches without remarking on them. But newcomers notice, and the lore captures their noticing. The momentary confusion, the automatic checking of one's own body for signs of illness, before registering that the cold is external, the slow understanding that the cold is coming from somewhere. Light in Blue Gate is also deliberately managed as a storytelling element. The accessible sections are maintained at human habitable illumination, functional, consistent, the product of systems that are working as designed. The deeper sections are described in accounts of the rare people who have gotten glimpses of them as differently lit, with qualities that suggest equipment whose light output serves purposes other than human comfort. There is something in the lore about the quality of light in the deepest accessed areas that several independent sources describe in similar but not identical ways. A kind of steadiness that normal lighting does not have. Not brighter, not warmer or cooler on any spectrum that the observers could name, but somehow more present, more constant, as if the light source is doing something beyond simply illuminating. Whether this is genuine description of an unusual physical phenomenon, or the projection of significance onto ordinary lighting by people who are in an emotionally heightened state in a significant location, the lore does not adjudicate. It is, again, suggestive rather than conclusive. The environmental lore trusts you to notice it and then to hold it as a question. The smell of Blue Gate is handled briefly but effectively. Long-running facilities develop characteristic smells. The combination of cleaning chemicals, processed air, the particular material composition of walls and floors and equipment, the trace outputs of whatever processes the facility runs. Blue Gate has this. The inhabitants, unsurprisingly, do not notice it. Visitors do, and their descriptions, typically framed as background observation rather than significant detail, paint a picture of a place that smells like long occupation, like maintained machinery, like a building that is alive in the sense of being actively running. The contrast is with ruins, which smell of decay and abandonment, and the slow work of nature reclaiming human space. Blue Gate does not smell like that. It smells like a place that is still itself. The spatial experience of moving through Blue Gate, as the lore constructs it, is one of progressive density, density of infrastructure, density of significance. The outer sections feel like spaces built for practical human habitation, functional and inhabited, and somewhat improvised. Moving inward, the spaces become more original, more cleanly architectural, more evidently designed rather than adapted. This spatial grammar is a physical version of the epistemological structure of the lore itself. The outermost layer is the most accessible, most improvised, most shaped by the post-ark necessities. The innermost layer is the most original, the most designed, the most connected to the facility's founding purpose. Moving inward is moving backward in time, or forward toward the truth, depending on how you frame it. Spatial memory is the name cognitive scientists give to the way we encode experience as place. We remember things better when they are associated with specific physical locations. This is why the ancient technique of the memory palace works. Walking through Blue Gate, even without accessing any of its text-based lore, tells you something. The building's physical grammar implies a structure of significance. What is central? What is peripheral? What is approached with difficulty? And what is casually navigable? The game is using this spatial memory mechanism deliberately. The difficulty of reaching the deeper sections, the physical navigation challenge, mirrors and reinforces the epistemological difficulty of accessing the deeper knowledge. Getting there is hard, not just narratively but physically, and that difficulty is itself meaningful, not just an obstacle. When you do reach the deeper sections, the physical experience of those spaces is designed to produce a specific kind of recognition, not the recognition of understanding, not the click of a puzzle solved, but the recognition of being in the presence of something whose full significance you cannot yet see. The spaces are built at a scale and with a quality that implies the importance of what they contain, before you have any idea what that is. Environmental storytelling is undervalued in game lore analysis precisely because it is non-verbal. You cannot quote a wall. But the walls at Blue Gate are saying things, and the things they are saying are consistent with and mutually reinforcing of the text-based lore in ways that reward the attention you give them. The space tells the same story as the records. They were built together, by people who understood that story could live in both dimensions simultaneously. Chapter 15: Parallel Institutions. What Blue Gate tells us about the broader world. It is one node in a world, and understanding it fully requires understanding how it relates to that world, both the pre-ark world that built it and the post-ark world that surrounds it. The lore of Ark Raiders does not give us an exhaustive picture of either, but it gives us enough that Blue Gate's position within both can be partially mapped. Let me start with the pre-ark world. The lore's picture of pre-ark civilization, assembled from fragments across the game, suggests a world that had developed several of what I would call legacy institutions, organizations with long histories, accumulated resources, and purposes that had evolved significantly from their founding charters. These are the kinds of institutions that every sufficiently developed civilization produces. Entities that start with specific functions, accrue authority and resources over time, and eventually develop into something more complex and harder to categorize than their original mandate implied. Blue Gate appears to have been one of these legacy institutions, or to have been closely connected to one. The indicators are the design features that imply long-term thinking, the compartmentalization that suggests a structure built over time rather than designed all at once, the layering of purposes visible in the physical structure. These are the characteristics of an institution that has been going for a while and has accumulated complexity. In the pre-ark world, such institutions existed across multiple domains, some governmental, some commercial, some sitting in the hybrid spaces that modern institutional structures tend to produce when entities serve multiple masters. Blue Gate's position in the intersection of governmental, military, and research interests places it in a category of real-world analogues that have historically been the locations of significant and sometimes controversial work, the places where states do things they cannot do under ordinary institutional accountability. The post-ark world has created new institutions from the ashes of the old, and these new institutions have their own relationships to the surviving remnants of the pre-ark order. Blue Gate, as one of the most intact pre-ark institutions, holds a specific kind of authority in this landscape, not just practical authority derived from its resources and capabilities, but something more like historical authority, the authority of continuity. Other survivor communities and factions look at Blue Gate and see something that persisted. That persistence is, in itself, a form of claim. Whatever Blue Gate was before, it is still here, which implies something about its significance. Facilities that did not matter fell, or were destroyed, or were abandoned. Blue Gate is still standing. That narrative of persistence has power, regardless of whether the specific reasons for that persistence are understood. This perception of Blue Gate from the outside as a place of unusual institutional continuity and therefore unusual significance shapes the relationships between Blue Gate and other survivor groups. It explains part of the mythological inflation we discussed earlier. It also explains the political complexity of those relationships. Other survivor groups have their own interests, their own claims, their own reasons to want access to what Blue Gate controls. The facility's persistence makes it a target not just for the Ark, but for human political actors who want to leverage what it represents. The keepers are not managing only the information inside the vaults. They are managing the facility's position in a broader political landscape, in which other survivor groups would, if they could, extract the facility's resources and authority and reframe them within their own projects. Blue Gate's independence is not just a matter of internal governance. It is maintained against external pressures as well. This broader political dimension of the law is less developed than the internal Blue Gate narrative, but the hints that exist are consistent with a picture of the post-Ark world as a place where the power vacuums left by the collapse of pre-Ark institutions have been partially filled by new configurations of authority, configurations that are still unstable, still contested, and still shaped by the legacy structures that survived the invasion. Blue Gate's relationship with the Raider community is one dimension of this broader political position. Raiders are, in part, a social formation created by the collapse of other institutional structures, people who operate in the margins between more organized groups, who have skills suited to the post-Ark environment, but are not fully integrated into any of the survivor communities that have emerged. They are simultaneously useful to Bluegate and a symptom of the broader social disorder that makes Bluegate's position complicated. The facility's management of raiders, tolerating their presence, giving them limited access, using them for specific purposes while managing the information they have access to, is a microcosm of Bluegate's management of its broader relationships. Everything is carefully calibrated. Nothing is given freely. The facility is always, at some level, managing its position in a landscape of competing interests. What this tells us about the broader world is something about the nature of institutions at the edge of collapse. Bluegate is an extreme case, an institution that has managed to persist under conditions that eliminated most others. But the strategies it employs and the challenges it faces are, in scaled form, the challenges of all surviving institutions in the post-ark world. How to maintain coherence when the external structures that once supported and constrained you are gone. How to manage resources and authority when the normal mechanisms of accountability no longer function. How to sustain purpose when the conditions that gave rise to that purpose have been transformed beyond recognition. Bluegate is not just a specific place with a specific history. It is also a laboratory for these questions, a case study in institutional survival under conditions of civilizational disruption, and the answers it has arrived at, good and bad, tell us something about what institutional survival costs and what it produces. The lesson is not entirely encouraging. Bluegate has survived, but what it has become in surviving, the power structure, the information management, the costs to community cohesion and trust, is different from, and in many ways worse than what it was before. Survival has been purchased at prices that the people who built the place would likely not have chosen to pay if they had known in advance what the bill would look like. And yet, and this is the part that makes the law genuinely complicated, there is a case that the prices were worth paying, that whatever Bluegate is protecting is important enough that even the distorted, compromised institution it has become is better than the alternative of that protection being lost. Maybe. The law holds that question open. And it is right to do so, because the answer depends on what is in the vaults, and on what it would actually mean for it to be accessed, and on questions about consequence and value that are genuinely hard to resolve in advance. Bluegate is an argument, made in institutional form, that some things are important enough to justify the costs of protection. The question it keeps asking, without answering, is whether it is right. Chapter 16. The Ark as Archaeologist. Evidence of non-human purpose. I want to return to the Ark's behaviour around Bluegate, but from a different angle than the one I took in Chapter 5. That chapter was about the pattern of the Ark's attention, the frequency, the persistence, the specificity. This chapter is about what the Ark is doing when it is there, the behaviour beyond the general pattern of showing up. The law, read carefully, contains accounts of Ark machine behaviour at Bluegate that are not simply aggressive. The machines are dangerous. That is consistent. They engage with human defenders and kill them. But in between and around that engagement, the machines do things that are harder to categorize. The simplest description is that they examine Ark machines at Bluegate, particularly during incursions that have reached deeper into the facility, show behavioral patterns that look more like systematic investigation than simple territorial expansion. They move through spaces in ways that suggest they are assessing rather than simply advancing. They interact with the facility's systems and structures in ways that would not be necessary if the objective were simple destruction. The law contains accounts of Ark machines at Bluegate stopping at specific points, not tactical stops, not pauses forced by resistance or physical obstacles, but apparently deliberate dwells at specific locations, points in the facility's layout that may correspond to significant structural features or system nodes, points that, if you map them, cluster in ways that suggest the machines were tracking something rather than moving randomly or following the path of least resistance. What they were tracking is not specified in the law, but the pattern of the clustering, mapped against what we know of the facility's layout, is suggestive. The points of apparent Ark dwell correspond, at least partially, with the routing of systems whose ultimate source is the deeper sections. The ark in this reading is following something toward its source, not following a human target, following a signal, or a type of material, or some property of the facility's infrastructure that the machines can detect and track. And that track leads inward, toward the core. This is where the idea of the ark as archaeologist comes in. Archaeology is the investigation of the past through its material traces. Archaeologists follow evidence, follow the distribution of artifacts, the patterns of construction, the residues of past activity, toward an understanding of what happened in a specific place, at a specific time. They do not have direct access to the events they study. They have the physical consequences of those events, and they reason backward from consequence to cause. The ark machines at Bluegate appear to be doing something structurally similar. They do not have direct access to the vaults. The facility's design and the keeper's defenses have prevented that. What they have is the physical consequences of the vault's existence, the signals, the thermal signatures, the electromagnetic properties that leak outward from whatever the vaults contain. And they are reasoning, in whatever way machine cognition works, backward from those consequences toward the source. The idea of an alien entity conducting archaeology on a human facility is strange enough. What makes it stranger is the nature of what it appears to be investigating. If the vaults contain pre-ark records of ark-related signals, records of the ark's own approach, made by humans before humans understood what they were observing, then the ark is potentially investigating records of itself, investigating evidence of its own past behavior, preserved by beings that did not understand what they were preserving. The philosophical implications of this are vertiginous. The ark arrived, disrupted everything, and has been spending years trying to access records that document its own arrival, as if the record of its coming is, to the ark, something worth possessing or analysing or possibly eliminating. Why would documentation of the ark's own history be significant to the ark? Several possibilities. The simplest is that the records represent a human capability for understanding ark behavior that the ark considers dangerous, and that accessing or destroying those records would eliminate that capability. In this version, the ark is conducting security operations, trying to recover or destroy information that has intelligence value against it. A more complex possibility is that the records contain something the ark does not itself fully have access to. Information about the period of its own approach, the anomalous signals, the precursor behavior that the ark's own systems did not record or no longer have access to. The idea that the ark might have gaps in its own memory, conditions under which it would value external records of its own past behavior, is strange but not incoherent. If the ark's cognition involves something like purposes understood across time, a coherent project with a past, present, and intended future, then information about its own past might be valuable to it for reasons that parallel the reasons humans value historical records. To understand where it has been, to access data that was produced during a period it cannot otherwise access, to complete a picture of itself. The law does not commit to this reading, but it is consistent with the behavioral evidence, and it would explain something that other explanations do not explain well. Why the ark's attention to Bluegate is so patient. If the ark were simply trying to eliminate a threat or acquire a resource, the multi-year pattern of probing incursions would be less explicable than a sustained investigation that has not yet found what it is looking for. Patient investigation implies a goal that has not yet been achieved, and if what the ark is investigating is its own history, the tenacity with which it returns is the tenacity of something that wants to understand itself. That framing, the ark as an entity with something like self-directed curiosity about its own past, is one of the most unsettling characterizations the law supports, because it implies a kind of consciousness that is not just instrumental. It implies something that does not just have purposes, but has questions. And an entity with questions, in a place that might contain answers, is not simply an enemy. It is something more complicated. The keepers, if they understand the nature of the ark's investigation, and the law hints that at least some of them do, are in an extraordinary position. They may be protecting information that the ark wants not to destroy, but to access. They may be standing between the Ark and a form of self-knowledge that the Ark values in ways that cannot be fully characterized as hostile. This complicates the adversarial frame enormously. If what you have is something your adversary wants not to destroy, but to possess, then your defensive posture produces a different outcome than if you successfully defend it. Defense does not eliminate the threat. It preserves the thing that generates the threat. As long as the vaults exist, the Ark has a reason to keep coming back. The keepers know this. The law makes it evident that they understand the logical structure of their situation, at least this far. They are not defending against a threat they expect to eventually eliminate. They are in a permanent state of management, keeping the Ark away from something that will always draw it back. Whether that is the right long-term strategy, whether there is any long-term strategy that is actually sustainable, is the question underlying all of Bluegate's present operations. And it is a question that the keeper's intelligence and commitment, significant as they are, may not be sufficient to answer. Chapter 17. Raiders Who Never Came Back. The Cost of Knowing. There is a particular genre of entry in Bluegate's records, not common, but present, that reads differently from the other logs and accounts. Personal in register, specific in detail, and cut off. These are the records of raiders who came to Bluegate with their own investigative agendas, who pushed further than the access they were granted, and who did not continue their records past a certain point. The game does not frame these explicitly as casualties of the keeper's information control. It does not say these people were removed because they found out too much. It just presents the records and the absence, and leaves you to work out what you think happened. This approach is consistent with the law's broader method. Evidence rather than assertion, pattern rather than explicit statement. But the pattern here is, if anything, more uncomfortable than most, because what it implies is not abstract institutional dynamics. It implies specific harm to specific people. Let me walk through some of what the fragments suggest. There is a raider whose records appear in Bluegate's external contact logs, someone who came to the facility multiple times, over what appears to have been a period of months, building relationships with inhabitants, learning the layout, gaining incrementally better access with each visit. The records of their presence are documented in the practical administrative way that Bluegate tracks contacts, who arrived, what they traded, where they went within the facility. Routine. At a certain point, the administrative records show them in a section of the facility that raiders do not typically access. Not the deepest sections, whatever happened before that threshold, but a level down from the normal raider accessible areas. The record of how they got there is absent, whether through bribery, through deception, through assistance from someone inside, or through a gap in the keeper's attention. The law does not say. What happens next is also absent. The administrative record just stops. No record of departure, no record of continued presence. No record of whatever was found or said or done in the section they had no business being in. Just the cutoff. There are other instances. A researcher, not formally a raider, but functionally similar, an outsider who came to Bluegate explicitly for information rather than material, whose inquiries into the facility's pre-ark operational history were initially accommodated, and then at a point corresponding roughly with questions about the facility's deepest sections, were no longer accommodated. The record of their subsequent attempts to re-establish access shows increasing frustration and eventually stops. Whether they left, or were helped to leave, or neither, the record does not say. There are also internal Bluegate figures in this category. People who were not raiders, but who appear in the records as increasingly uncomfortable with the information management structure, who asked questions too directly, or accessed areas they should not have accessed, or spoke too openly to outsiders about their observations. These figures also tend to have records that stop without resolution. In some cases, there are vague notations about reassignment or departure. In the most concerning cases, there is simply nothing. The cumulative weight of these absences is one of the law's most carefully managed effects. Individually, each absence could be innocent. People stop keeping records for many reasons. People leave facilities, move on, die in Ark incursions, succumb to illness, make choices that redirect their lives. The post-ark world has a high background rate of people who simply stop being where they were, but the clustering of these absences around a specific kind of activity, around the specific act of pressing too close to the real questions about Blue Gate's core, is statistically remarkable. If the absences were random, you would not expect them to concentrate so specifically around the exact behavior that would be most threatening to the keeper's information control. The distribution is not random. The law is showing you that. What it is not doing is telling you what the distribution means, because there are multiple explanations for a non-random clustering of this kind that do not require deliberate, harmful action. The keepers might be orchestrating departures rather than disappearances, persuading, incentivizing, coercing people to leave and cease their investigations in ways that stop short of harm but effectively produce the same pattern. The people who push too far might have left voluntarily once they understood the real stakes, choosing self-preservation over curiosity. The absences might represent people who found what they were looking for and chose not to record it, for reasons of their own. But the law also does not rule out the darker reading, and it presents it in a way that makes the darker reading feel, if not certain, then at least seriously possible. The cumulative portrait of Blue Gate as a place where certain knowledge carries personal risk is built gradually across many fragments, each individually deniable, collectively overwhelming. This is the part of the Blue Gate law that I find most morally challenging. Not the keeper's abstract choices about information control, not the political dynamics of the community's governance, but the specific possibility that people who wanted to know things, who came to Blue Gate in the spirit that raiders are built around, curiosity, risk tolerance, the drive toward places others will not go, paid costs for that spirit that nobody who sent them there warned them about. Raiders accept danger as a premise. The Ark's machines are an explicit and understood threat. The physical risks of operating in damaged post-Ark environments are understood, but the risk of being harmed, not by the Ark, but by the institution you are trying to access. That is a different kind of danger, one that the mythology around Blue Gate conspicuously does not prepare visitors for. If the keepers have harmed people to protect their secrets, the ethics of what they are doing are not complicated by the importance of what they are protecting. There is no secret valuable enough to justify eliminating people who are trying to discover it. That principle does not have an exception for especially important information. The keeper's belief in the criticality of what they hold does not grant them license to harm those who seek it. But the law does not fully confirm that the keepers have done this. It builds a case, not a conviction. And the uncertainty is not just narrative caution. It reflects something true about how this kind of thing works in real institutions. The evidence is rarely clean. The responsibility is usually diffuse. The actions that produce the pattern of absences are often individually defensible, even when the pattern as a whole is not. The raiders who never came back are not just a detail in the Blue Gate law. They are a test of how you relate to institutions that do harm in the name of good. Whether you are capable of holding two things simultaneously, the importance of what Blue Gate holds, and the cost of how it has been held. Both are real, both matter, and the discomfort of holding them together is, I think, exactly the discomfort the law is designed to produce. The next raider who goes looking for the real answers at Blue Gate is not just inheriting a mystery, they are inheriting a line of people who looked before them, some of whom found what they were looking for, and some of whom are not here to tell us what that was. Chapter 18. Theories of the Ark. What Blue Gate's records might ultimately reveal. Every attempt to understand Blue Gate eventually leads to the same question. What is the Ark, really? Not what it does. That is extensively documented across the game's lore. What it is, where it came from, what motivated or produced it, what it wants in a sense that goes beyond the operational description of its behavior. The vaults at Blue Gate, if the reading of them as a repository of pre-ark monitoring data is correct, represent the closest thing to an answer that exists in the game world. Not a complete answer, possibly not even a direct answer, but data that was collected over an extended period by a facility that was apparently tracking something that turned out to be the Ark, before anyone knew That was what they were tracking. Let me try to lay out the major theoretical possibilities for what that data might reveal. I want to be clear that these are not confirmed law. They are readings of patterns, interpretations of what the available evidence points toward, without the evidence being definitive. Think of this as a set of hypotheses that the data in the vaults might be able to adjudicate, if that data ever becomes accessible. Theory 1. The Ark is an automated system from elsewhere that arrived on Earth as the execution of a previously set objective. In this theory, the Ark is not in any meaningful sense intelligent or purposive beyond the execution of its programmed function. It is sophisticated machinery pursuing sophisticated goals, but those goals were set elsewhere and at another time, and the Ark itself has no more ability to deviate from them or understand them than a computer running code understands the intention of the programmer. If this theory is correct, the pre-ark signals that Blue Gate was collecting were the leading edge of that system's approach, the advanced wave of an automated process that had been in transit for a long time and was finally arriving at its programmed destination. The ark's behavior would be fully explicable as optimization, with no layer of intention or understanding above the mechanical. This is, in some ways, the most pessimistic theory, because if the ark is purely automated, if there is no cognition to engage, no purpose that can be understood or negotiated with, or redirected, then the only response available is resistance. You cannot reason with a program. You can only try to stop it, and it will keep coming until either it achieves its objective or it is destroyed. Theory 2. The Ark is an intelligent system whose intelligence is genuine but alien, organized differently from human cognition, pursuing purposes that are comprehensible in principle but require significant translation. In this theory, the behavioral evidence of communication-like signals and targeted purposive activity is evidence of real intelligence, but intelligence that does not map onto human frameworks in obvious ways. If this theory is correct, the pre-ark signals were the ark attempting to make contact, to communicate its presence and, potentially, its purposes in a format that no human system was equipped to receive meaningfully. The invasion, in this reading, was not the first move of a hostile force, but the continuation of a failed first contact scenario that humans did not recognize as first contact. This theory opens possibilities that the first does not. If the ark is intelligent and its purposes are comprehensible, then understanding those purposes, which is what the vault data might enable, creates options beyond simple resistance, not necessarily negotiation in any traditional sense, but at minimum, a different relationship to the situation. One where the question is not only how to fight back, but what, exactly, one is fighting against and why. Theory 3. The Ark is something that has been here before, not in the sense of a previous visit from outside, but in the sense of having a prior relationship with Earth that predates human civilization. The lore contains hints, geological anomalies, certain categories of evidence in the environmental descriptions that suggest the Ark's presence has signatures that go further back than the invasion. If this theory is correct, the pre-ark signals that Blue Gate was collecting are not evidence of something approaching from outside. They are evidence of something waking up, or returning to activity, or reaching a threshold in a cycle that has a much longer period than human civilization. The Ark did not arrive, it re-emerged. This changes the whole frame of the human-Ark conflict. It would mean the Ark is not alien in the sense of coming from elsewhere. It is native in the sense of being part of Earth's deep history, something that human civilization has lived on top of without knowing what it was living on top of. The vaults, in this reading, contain not just pre-invasion monitoring data, but records of the facility's gradual recognition of this much longer history, records of people slowly realizing that the anomalies they were tracking were not new phenomena, but new intensifications of phenomena that had always been there. Theory 4, which I want to be careful about because it is the most speculative and the most difficult to articulate. The Ark is the destination. Not that it is going somewhere, but that it is what something was always heading toward, that the development of sufficiently complex civilization on Earth was always going to produce or attract or awaken something like the Ark. But the invasion is not an event in human history, but a phase of a much longer process in which human civilization was a transitional form. This theory is philosophically destabilizing in a way the others are not, because it implies that human civilization was not defeated by the Ark, it was completed by it, that the pre-Ark world, with all its technological development and accumulated knowledge, was a stage in a process whose next stage is the Ark invasion and what comes after. If that reading has any validity, the vaults are not just records of the past, they are documentation of a transition that is still ongoing, records that, if read correctly, might illuminate not just what happened, but what is supposed to happen next. I am not asserting that any of these theories is correct. I am saying that the law supports all of them as possibilities, and that the vault data, if it contains what I think it contains based on the available hints, might be capable of distinguishing between them, or might reveal something else entirely. A reality that does not fit any of these frameworks, because it requires frameworks that humans have not yet developed. The game's law, at its most ambitious, is pointing toward the possibility that the answer to what the Ark is would require a complete reconceptualization of humanity's relationship to its own planet, its own history, and its own future. That the comfortable categories, invasion and resistance, alien and native, before and after, are not wrong exactly, but are insufficient to hold the actual complexity of what is happening. Blue Gate's vaults are where that reconceptualization would begin, if it begins at all. They are the archive of the questions. Whether they also contain the answers, or only better questions, is the mystery that the game has been building toward. And whatever is in there, whatever the raiders who eventually reach it find, will not leave the world the same. Chapter 19. The Future of Blue Gate. What happens next? The lore of Ark Raiders does not give you a conclusion to the Blue Gate story. It gives you a situation, detailed, pressurized, pointing in multiple directions, and leaves you inside it, which means that any attempt to articulate the facility's future is unavoidably speculation. But informed speculation, grounded in the patterns the lore has established, is different from guessing. It is a form of extension, carrying the logic of the present forward into possibilities it generates. So let me be explicit that this chapter is different from the others. It is not analysis of what the lore says. It is reasoning from what the lore says toward what might happen next, and why those futures matter for how we understand Blue Gate now. The most straightforward future is one of continuation. The keepers maintain their control. The Ark continues its patient attention. Raiders continue to operate in the accessible sections. The second generation at Blue Gate channels its restlessness into forms that the keepers can manage without fundamental change. The vaults remain closed. Everything that has been will continue to be, in a slowly deteriorating form. This future is plausible, but the law suggests it is not sustainable. The pressures converging on Blue Gate, generational change, Ark persistence, raider presence, the slow degradation of keeper authority, are not static. They are accumulating. The number of people who suspect the full picture is increasing. The keeper's ability to manage information is decreasing as the community grows and changes. The situation has the structure of something that is heading toward a threshold, not an equilibrium. The most likely form of that threshold, based on the patterns the law has established, is access. Someone, a raider, a member of the second generation, a keeper who has decided their conscience outweighs their loyalty, will reach the vaults, or will access enough of the data within them to change what is known. The information management will fail, not necessarily all at once, but in ways that are irreversible. What happens after access depends enormously on who gets it and in what circumstances. The keeper's fear about uncontrolled release is not irrational. Information that arrives without context, in the middle of a contested situation, can cause damage that a managed release would not. The content of the vaults, if it is as significant as the law implies, is exactly the kind of thing that mishandled release could make worse rather than better. The most hopeful version of the post-access future is one in which whoever reaches the vaults is also equipped to understand what they find and to communicate it in ways that produce the kind of reconceptualization it calls for, rather than the panicked reaction or political weaponization that the keepers fear. This is not guaranteed. It may not even be likely, but the game is structured, in the logic of its lore, to create the possibility that players, raiders who have done the work of understanding Blue Gate's full history before reaching the vaults, might be exactly the right people to hold that information. That is a generous reading of the game's design philosophy, but I think it is the right one. The investment required to follow the Blue Gate lore to its depths is a form of preparation, not preparation for the physical challenge of reaching the vaults, preparation for the cognitive and ethical challenge of knowing what is in them. The lore has been building, through all of its complexity and ambiguity and deliberate difficulty, toward a reader who can hold the full picture, who understands the keeper's genuine fears without endorsing their choices, who understands the ark's non-random attention without knowing yet what it means, who understands the generational dynamics and the raider's position and the historical layering and the significance of what has been preserved, and who can bring all of that context to bear on whatever the vaults ultimately reveal. The future of Blue Gate in the game's ongoing development is also, necessarily, the future of the game's own lore-building project. What has been constructed so far is a foundation, elaborate, carefully laid, densely interconnected. What gets built on it will determine whether the foundation's quality is realized into something that does it justice. The risk, for any lore project this ambitious, is the revelation trap. When you build mystery over a long period with this much care, the moment of revelation is extraordinarily difficult to execute well. Any specific answer to what the vaults contain will for some players be less interesting than what they imagined. Any concrete characterization of the ark's nature will eliminate some of the interpretive possibilities that have made the mystery so rich. The best version of this project, in my estimation, is one that treats the revelation not as an answer, but as a new set of questions. Not the moment when the mystery is solved, but the moment when the mystery is finally understood to have been about something even larger than it appeared. The opening of the vaults is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the story that Blue Gate has been keeping safe all this time. Whether the game's development team takes that approach is outside the lore itself, but the lore as it currently exists is built for it. The architecture of the mystery is big enough to hold an answer that opens rather than closes. The future of Blue Gate, in the world of the game, is uncertain in all the right ways. The pressures are real. The stakes are real. The people involved, keepers and raiders, and the second generation, are complex enough that the outcome cannot be predicted from their types alone. It depends on choices that have not yet been made, and the sense that the future is genuinely open, that what happens depends on things that are still in play, is what makes a world worth exploring. Blue Gate is not a monument to a concluded history. It is a place where history is still being made. Chapter 20. Why this place? Why now? A final reckoning. I want to end where I always end up when I spend enough time with a piece of lore, this well constructed. Not with the content itself, but with the why. Why does Blue Gate work? Why does this location, in this game, do things to the imagination that most game locations do not? The easy answer is that the mystery is good, that the puzzle is intricate, that the history is layered and internally consistent, and built with enough specificity to feel real. All of that is true, but it is not quite sufficient as an explanation, because there are plenty of games with good mysteries and intricate puzzles and internally consistent histories that do not produce the feeling that Blue Gate produces. What Blue Gate does, that is harder to do, is make you feel that the stakes are real, not that a fictional character is in danger,